And this is a list of Democratic amendments. Does she have the list? Okay. Let me get this one.
That's yours.
Okay. Here's a clean copy.
Okay.
And so we go in this order, going back and forth.
Right.
Okay.
We'll go on this one.
Committee will come to order, quorum being present. Before we start, I think most people are aware that we received some sad news this morning. Our colleague Elijah Cummings passed this morning. And on a personal note, a longtime legislator in Virginia who I served with, represented the same district, multi-member district, for 5 years in the House, and we served together when I was in the state Senate, also passed this morning, Alan Diamondstein. So we would want to start them with a moment of silence in their honor. Thank you. Before we turn to the markup, there's a matter of committee business we need to address. Mr. Timmons of South Carolina has left the committee, and Mr. Murphy of North Carolina has joined the committee. I'd like to welcome Mr. Murphy to the committee. Welcome. Mr. Timmons' departure leaves a vacancy on the subcommittee on early childhood, elementary, and secondary education, and a vacancy on the subcommittee on higher education and workforce investment. Having consulted with the minority, I will ask unanimous consent that Mr. Keller of Pennsylvania be removed from the subcommittee on workforce protections and added to the subcommittee on early childhood, elementary, and secondary education. Without objection, so ordered. We now have a vacancy on the subcommittee on higher education and workforce investment and a vacancy on the subcommittee on workforce protections. Ask unanimous consent that Mr. Murphy be added to fill these vacancies on the two subcommittees. And without objection, so ordered. We turn now to the markup. The committee meets today pursuant to notice to consider H.R. 3, the Lower Drug Costs Now Act of 2019. Chair announces that any request for recorded votes will be ruled pursuant to Clause 2, Rule 11 of the Rules of the House and Rule 13B of the Rules of the Committee. Pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 1, the chair may recess the committee at any point. I now recognize myself to make an opening statement today. Today we're marking up H.R. 3, the Lower Drug Costs Now Act, which is an ambitious plan to cut the cost of prescriptive drugs for all Americans. Drug costs in America are out of control. Today, annual spending on prescriptive drugs across the healthcare system totals more than $450 billion, way over $1,000 a person. Skyrocketing costs of drugs is undermining the health and financial security of seniors, taxpayers, and American consumers who are routinely forced to pay far more for the same drugs as people in other countries. In some cases, Americans are paying 3 or 4 times more, sometimes as much as 30 or more times more than patients in other countries, including the United Kingdom, Japan, and Canada, for the exact same drugs. While some of my colleagues will argue that high drug prices are needed to offset the costs of research and developing new drugs, the evidence is otherwise, because 9 out of 10 of the largest pharmaceutical companies today spend more on marketing, sales, and overhead than they do on research. The majority of new life-saving drugs are actually discovered using taxpayer-funded medical research from the National Institutes of Health. And further, perhaps more importantly, the discovery of new drugs is only useful if people can afford them. Unfortunately, 3 in 10 adults decide to forego taking their prescribed medication in the past year because of high costs. In addition to pricing out consumers, the unsustainable cost of drugs is also acting as a drag on our economy. In 2016 alone, employer-based health plans spent nearly $84 billion on drugs, an amount that will continue to burden both workers and businesses. The American people have made it clear that they want Congress to take action, and this is what we're going to do today. The Lower Drug Costs Now Act delivers on our promise to lower drug prices in 5 key ways. First, the bill mandates the Secretary of Health and Human Services to negotiate directly with drug companies to get a fair deal for American consumers. These beneficiaries will include not just those on Medicare, but also those with private insurance and employer-based plans. When Medicare Part D was enacted, the legislation actually prohibited the Secretary from negotiating drug prices. This legislation mandates negotiation on behalf of the American consumer. Second, the bill reverses and prevents unjustified price increases by requiring drug manufacturers to provide a rebate for certain drug prices increases that exceed inflation. Third, the legislation caps negotiated drug prices by limiting American prices to that prices charged in similar countries no more than 120% of what is charged in other countries, so that drug companies will stop ripping off Americans while charging those in other countries less for the same drug. Fourth, the bill creates a $2,000 out-of-pocket limit on drug costs for Medicare beneficiaries. And finally, the Lower Drug Costs Now Act will reinvest savings from negotiated drug prices in research and innovation to find new medical breakthroughs, as well as other investments in the healthcare system. It is important to note that many of these provisions have been endorsed by President Trump himself, and the CBO has evaluated the effectiveness of the bill. It has concluded that the bill will save Medicare Part D $345 billion, will save businesses about $45 billion, and consumers $55 billion over the next 10 years. The Lower Drug Costs Now Act is an opportunity for Congress to address the unsustainable cost of prescriptive drugs and help constituents we were elected to serve. I urge all committee members to support the bill, and I now yield to the ranking member, Dr. Fox, for the purpose of an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also want to take a moment to recognize Representative Elijah Cummings. As someone who served with him on the Oversight and Reform Committee, I'm well aware of his passion for public service, and my thoughts and prayers are with his family. I also want to welcome Dr. Murphy to the committee. We're very pleased to have him with us. Workers and families across America are rightly concerned about the cost of their prescription drugs. In fact, 1 in 4 Americans worries about affording medication. Stories about prescription drug costs skyrocketing by over 400% are maddening and frustrating. It is no surprise that 70% of Americans consider this a top priority and want Congress to tackle prescription drug costs. This is a serious problem that requires a serious approach by Congress. And that is why congressional efforts to bring down drug costs for the American people have been and should continue to be a collaborative and bipartisan effort. Under Republican leadership in previous years, members of Congress worked in a bipartisan fashion to make real progress on this problem. This year, House and Senate committees have continued working together on bipartisan bills to address the high cost and increased price transparency of prescription drugs. 2 of these bills have become law, and others are awaiting further action in both chambers. But just last month, Speaker Pelosi sabotaged those previous bipartisan efforts by introducing H.R. 3, a radical drug pricing scheme without member input or the collaborative committee process. H.R. 3 is nothing more than a down payment on Medicare for All, a government-run health care system that would eliminate private insurance, including employer-sponsored coverage. Medicare for All would force seniors into a one-size-fits-all plan along with everyone else and end popular Medicare Advantage plans. Over half the Democrat conference supports this radical approach. Sadly, H.R. 3 is just the latest in a stream of extreme socialist policies championed by congressional Democrats. Specifically, the Speaker's drug scheme would upend our market-based system by nationalizing the prescription drug industry through foreign price controls, retroactive tax penalties, arbitrary inflation caps, and federally mandated negotiations. Let's be clear, governments don't negotiate, they dictate. The radical approach taken by H.R. 3 jeopardizes innovation and investment. Just look at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD countries, for proof. European companies invested 24% more on prescription drug research and development than U.S.-based companies before certain European OECD countries implemented the same types of price controls, including in Pelosi's legislation. By 2015, after adhering to government price controls instead of relying on competition, European-based companies in those countries had fallen behind their U.S. counterparts by 40%. Speaker Pelosi's scheme could also jeopardize U.S. patents access to new and innovative medicines and cures. According to research published last year, American patients have greater access to life-saving treatments that combat cancer and other deadly diseases than citizens of other countries. It stated, quote, nearly 90% of newly launched medicines from 2011 to 2017 were available in the U.S., compared to just 2/3 in the United Kingdom, half in Canada and France, and 1/3 in Australia, end quote. House Democrats are so committed to this extreme plan that they rushed a CBO score that provides less than a full picture of the cost of this ill-advised legislation, and are intent on ramming this legislation through the House before the full implications are known or carefully considered. And some of your amendments today will show that. Today's markup is another example of the committee's focus on radical socialist priorities, including one-size-fits-all mandated minimum wage hikes, trial lawyer rewards, taxpayer-funded pension bailouts, and heavy-handed government intervention targeting small businesses. We shouldn't be pursuing policies that will harm the health and well-being of American patients, and we shouldn't destroy a system that allows the U.S. to lead the world in new cures and treatments. Republicans stand ready to work with Democrats to push for legislation that promotes competition, lowers out-of-pocket costs for consumers, and establishes transparency and accountability in drug pricing. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Without objection, all members who wish to insert written opening statements into the record may do so by submitting them to the committee clerk electronically by the end of the day today. House rules require a copy of measures to be made available to members. The copy of measures be made available to members in the public at least 24 hours in advance, and this was done. The committee will now proceed with the consideration of the bill, H.R. 3, for amendment. The bill was circulated in advance, and printed copies are available. The clerk will designate the bill.
H.R. 3, to establish a fair price negotiation program, protect the Medicare program from excessive price increases, and establish an out-of-pocket maximum for Medicare Part D enrollees and for other purposes.
Without objection, first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point, and any amendment offered shall be considered as read. I now recognize myself for the purpose of offering an amendment in the nature of a substitute. The clerk shall designate the amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3, offered by Mr. Scott of Virginia.
Objection, the amendment shall be considered its original text and open to amendment at any point. The amendment in the nature of a substitute has already been distributed and is in each of your folders. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes to explain the amendment in the nature of a substitute. The amendment in the nature of a substitute makes a number of changes to Title I of H.R. 3. These changes are the product of extensive feedback on the legislation from stakeholders, experts, and members, and will make the bill stronger. That will further ensure that the American people will enjoy lower prescriptive drug prices. The drafting of the amendment in nature of substitute was also coordinated with the committees on Ways and Means and Energy and Commerce, so that the bills reported by the 3 committees of jurisdiction can be reconciled into one bill. Changes have been incorporated into the amendment in nature of substitute include the following. 1, the number of drugs which will be subject to negotiation, which was originally set at a minimum of 25, has been increased to a minimum of 30 beginning in 2028 and 35 beginning in 2033. The present law prohibits such negotiation. This bill not only allows it, but now actually requires the price of a minimum of 30 drugs to be negotiated. Drugs will remain eligible for negotiation until 2 generic competitors are available, as opposed to 1 in the underlying bill. There is a new emergency negotiation mechanism which will be instituted to address drugs with high launch prices. Clarifications have been made to ensure protections for people with disabilities, the elderly, children, and the terminally ill. Technical edits ensure that the bill applies to all U.S. territories, and clarifications have been made to ensure applicability of the maximum fair price to retiree-only health plans. A note for the members that although it was originally intended that the 340B program be addressed in this amendment of nature substitute, the chair has been notified that this may exceed this committee's jurisdiction and therefore will not be addressed at our markup. However, we have worked with our colleagues on the Energy and Commerce Committee who shared our members' concerns and support removing the original 340B language, thereby clarifying the policy intent. This policy will be reflected in their committee's amendment nature substitute that is being also marked up this morning. And so we thank the Energy and Commerce Committee for working with us to make that change and for continuing to work with this committee to ensure that that change will be reflected in the final legislative package. Are there other members who wish to be recognized for further discussion on the amendment nature of a substitute?
Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from Michigan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The rising costs of prescription drugs in America is an issue that impacts families, workers, patients, and households across this great nation. That's not a debate. If we are going, though, to address this problem, we need to set aside party politics and enact bold solutions. Under Republican leadership at the House Committee on Energy and Commerce, of which I'm also a member and is, as you've said, meeting on this bill right now, we worked on bipartisan bills to address the cost and transparency of prescription drugs. In 2016, Congress passed the 21st Century Cures Act, bipartisan legislation that I co-sponsored, which accelerated discovery and development of new cures and treatments, giving patients faster access to life-saving drugs. Then the FDA Reauthorization Act of 2017 was signed into law, leading to the approval of nearly 1,000 different brand-name drugs. This gave FDA additional resources to combat price hikes by bringing competition into the market and empowering patients with choice. Instead of continuing this bipartisan work, Speaker Pelosi has ignored member input and abandoned the regular committee process in favor of a political ploy to appease her radical far-left base. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce rightly argues, and I quote, "By imposing government price controls on prescription drugs, H.R. 3 will reduce investments in medical research, put at risk over 700,000 American jobs, and potentially shift cutting-edge medical research to foreign countries like China." The legislation before us today, H.R. 3, is a deeply flawed partisan drug pricing scheme that will jeopardize patients' access to new cures and treatments. And the amendment we are considering actually makes this bad bill even worse. By making this bill even more extreme, the Democrats are stripping patients and families of choices and treatments to apparently appease a group of far-left members. Among many of the radical and troubling policy failures in H.R. 3, the most concerning is the promotion of an unprecedented amount of government interference in private market negotiations, which will eliminate choice and competition in our healthcare system. Additionally, investment in research and development for future treatments would be significantly jeopardized, putting breakthrough cures for diseases like Alzheimer's, cancer, sickle cell disease, and others at risk. Countries around the world that have adopted drug pricing schemes like those included in H.R. 3 have not reaped the benefits that Democrats claim this bill would provide. In fact, they face decreased access to innovative new medicines, increased wait times for treatment, and supply shortages for in-demand drugs. We can and must do better. In the past, Democrats and Republicans have come together to work in a bipartisan manner to tackle this issue. But during a time of unparalleled political divide, my colleagues have decided to pursue politics over progress. The markup of this socialist agenda drug pricing scheme is another example of the committee's Democrats' focus on radical proposals, including one-size-fits-all mandated minimum wage hikes, trial lawyer rewards, restrictions on worker choice and freedom of speech, and heavy-handed government intervention targeting small businesses. We're better than this. Advancing H.R. 3, Speaker Pelosi's socialist agenda drug pricing scheme, will hurt the development of cures and treatments and, more importantly, people's lives. It is a disservice to those who have elected us to be their choice in Congress. I'll close by repeating what the committee's Republican leader, Representative Fox, said during her opening statement. It bears repeating. Republicans stand ready to work with Democrats to push for legislation that promotes competition, lowers out-of-pocket costs for consumers, and establishes transparency and accountability in drug pricing. With that, I yield back.
Thank you. Are there others who wish to be heard on the amendment? Gentlelady from California, Ms. Davis.
Thank you. I want to strike the last word. Mr. Chairman, you know, when remembering our beautiful colleague, Elijah Cummings, I learned today that he has been playing a very key role in fighting hard for affordable health care as well as lowering drug care costs. And I think it might be appropriate, I'm not sure what, as we move forward to think about this bill and recognize him in the naming of the bill as well. You know, I think that this issue is so personal for everybody. We had testimony here, and we certainly have many, many constituents who share their stories with us every single day. I have a constituent from San Diego who told my staff about how the prices have been unaffordable for his daughter's cystic fibrosis drugs. And this is something that this bill can fix. This new drug negotiation process will have at least 30 drugs negotiated and possibly up to 250. Empowering the Health and the Human Service Secretary to negotiate these prices is essential in saving money, and it will save our constituents for life-saving prescription drugs. I have another constituent as well who reached out to me about some drug companies' greed. He's a 68-year-old man with COPD who uses an inhaler, and he was charged $410 for a 30-day supply despite his Part D coverage. He is on Medicare, so he was not eligible for the drug company's assistance in affording the medication. If he were in Canada, that drug would cost him $109. So that's absurd. We need to acknowledge and accept that. We have to decide how we're going to move forward. We need to make sure that such a common drug is easily affordable. We shouldn't have drug companies making prices so high that even with government assistance, they are unaffordable. This bill estimates that beneficiaries can save up to $126 billion in out-of-pocket costs due to lower cost sharing and lower Part D premiums. You know, we hear from our friends, and believe me, I come from a district that has many, many small and medium-sized drug companies. And we know that there's an issue around innovation here. But the reality is that we're going to be capturing billions and billions of dollars through this bill. And if the Congress acts appropriately, efficaciously, we will be able to participate in making sure that those dollars go to the NIH, that they go to the drug companies, that they fund far more innovation than they're funding today, and that they can even direct many cures that could be in our future. So I want us to remember that. I wanted to remember the personal stories that we have heard. This is personal for me too. I've said that in this committee before because I have a family member who relies on research to fight a life-threatening disease. And I think about that entire family. So open up that discussion so that we really can understand that this can have great benefit down the road and that we can address the concerns that you have. I hope you will join us in this effort today. I yield back.
Thank you. Others want to comment on the amendment nature substitute? Gentleman from Connecticut, Mr. Courtney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I strongly support this amendment, which makes a good bill even better. And I would just, again, want to begin my remarks by reminding people that the American people actually expressed loudly their position on this issue not that long ago, last November, when we had a midterm election that had the largest turnout since 1914, that elected a new majority with a plurality of 10 million votes, shattered all of the conventional wisdom about gerrymandered districts and voter suppression, et cetera. Again, people came out in historic numbers. And if you read the exit polls and look at the exit polls, the number one issue was the cost of health care. And if you drill down even deeper below that, it was the cost of prescription drugs. What we are doing today is keeping faith with those folks who came out and said enough is enough, that we are paying too much in this country, both as individual patients, but also as businesses, and we have got to put into effect reforms that are going to do what almost is a given in other parts of the world, that patients are not left with these exorbitant costs for drugs that have been off patent in many instances, like insulin, for many years. So again, when we look at what this amendment is doing, it is allowing the leverage of large groups to negotiate better prices. There is nothing wrong with the transparency bills, which have been described by our friends on the other side. But at the end of the day, transparency does not translate into lower costs unless you have better leverage to negotiate a better price. And you only have to look at the Veterans Administration to see that right here in the good old USA, we have seen the government do good things for veterans in terms of lowering their prescription drug costs. It is wildly popular with folks who, again, served our country and qualify for veterans' health benefits. I know I have the largest military installation in the Northeast with the Groton Sub Base, 10,000 sailors and officers, lots of retirees. The VA drug benefit, again, is viewed as a godsend in terms of lowering people's out-of-pocket costs for critical medications. And we are simply extending that model to the Medicare system, and in this committee, we are extending that model to the commercial market through employer-based plans, because we have jurisdiction over ERISA. Again, something that I think sometimes is overlooked is that that is part of the Education and Labor's work. Back when the Affordable Care Act was passed, this is the committee that originated reforms in the private health insurance market, eliminating pre-existing conditions, extending health coverage to age 26 in families, and the elimination of lifetime limits. And even when our friends tried to repeal the Affordable Care Act, they figured out that age 26 was something to basically leave alone, and pre-existing conditions to leave alone. And what we are doing today is just giving private employers the benefit of lower negotiated prices with the leverage that the government can bring to bear. I would note, however, no one is forcing employer plans to participate in this program. If an employer decides that they think they can get a better deal than what is contemplated in this legislation, they can opt out. This is not mandatory. This is not involuntary. This is not socialism. But what it is just common sense application of market forces in terms of giving the leverage of large numbers of consumers to get a better deal for the American people. In Connecticut, I checked with the insurance department a couple days ago just to see what the impact of prescription drug costs are doing to employer-based plans in our state. And what they have shown is that since 2010, the portion of premiums that employers are paying for health insurance has gone up from 15% of the cost of premium was for prescription drugs. Today, it is 23%. The costs are, again, just burying employers and businesses in terms of higher and higher medical costs. And what this amendment is doing and what this committee's work is doing on Title I is, again, extending the benefit of just good old-fashioned market economics in terms of using leverage to get lower prices for prescription drugs and allow that benefit to go into the private sector so that companies are, again, not going to be struggling with the skyrocketing costs that the Connecticut Insurance Department just reported to me yesterday. So again, I strongly support the chairman's amendment in nature of a substitute. This bill will be, in my opinion, the most significant piece of legislation on health care that will happen in this Congress. And again, I think this committee should come together in terms of giving it the strongest support possible and providing the relief that people so loudly and clearly voted for last November. I yield back.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I think we are all outraged at the outrageous costs of prescription drugs. I mean, that is something that impacts, I'm sure, a lot of family members of folks that are sitting in this hearing room today, and certainly a lot of our constituents. And it is a bipartisan issue. Unfortunately, what we have before us today, and it deserves a bipartisan solution, but the bill before us today, H.R. 3, was done in secret, was not open to individual member input and contribution, so it was not done in a deliberative process. It's being shoved at the American people through this committee. And it is there are only, especially in this day and age, Mr. Chairman, you know this, there's very few issues that probably unite us, but the outrageous cost of prescription drugs and what that does on families and impacting individuals is one of those issues that truly qualifies as being right for good bipartisan work. And so I'm really disappointed in the fact that we're bringing this bill up when it was done essentially in Speaker Pelosi's office. It was done in secret. There was no input from members, the people, those of us who have obviously the responsibility of jurisdiction within this committee. And so I think that important bipartisan issues, what we have before us today, really deserves some deliberative bipartisan work. And quite frankly, H.R. 3 doesn't pass that test. So thank you, Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from the Northern Mariana Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
Recognized.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. So the H.R. 3, Mr. Chairman, is truly a true bold proposal to lower drug costs for the American people. And I am grateful, Mr. Chairman, for your decision to make the technical edits throughout the bill, throughout Title I, and clarifying that this bill applies to Americans living in the territories and commonwealths as well, because drug prices out there are outrageous, where people have the least money. So I'm grateful for this. I thank the chairman and his staff for this consideration or this inclusion. And I support the ANS introduced by Chairman Scott, and I yield back my time.
Thank you. Others wish to be recognized. Gentleman from Tennessee, Dr. Rowe.
I thank the gentleman. As one of the, I think, 3 people in this room that can actually write prescriptions, I've had the privilege of the last 40-plus years of seeing the advances in medicine and the improvement in the quality of people's lives. My concern is not, I think everyone on this dais agrees that prescription drug prices are too high. We need to lower those. But when you have a situation where you are threatening up to a 95% tax on companies who fail to comply with this, it would be the same thing. Let me give you an example, not prescription drugs. Let's say the government decides to buy Suburbans, and they'll say, we'll pay $40,000 for a Suburban, but the Suburban actually costs $60,000. Well, guess what? You're not going to have any Suburbans. And that's my concern with this, is that we will cut off this incredible flow of new medicines and research that actually are improving the lives of people. I think we need to really think through this, because that is my major concern. It's not lowering the price. And look, for orphan drugs that are out there, and later in this hearing, I have a markup I think everyone in this room ought to support, an amendment, that everyone in this room should support, that will help lower drug prices in a realistic way. That's my major concern, is when the government negotiates in that way, you're going to end up, if you did that with an F-35, people wouldn't build F-35s. If they cost $100 million and we'll pay $30 million for it, then you're not going to have them. And that's my major concern, Mr. Chairman. I think we need to think through this. I want to work with you, absolutely, to help lower the drug prices. That's been one of the issues I've worked on since I've been here. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you. Gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Wilson.
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady's recognized.
It is time to rein in out-of-control prescription drug prices. Not tomorrow, but today, right now. Pharmaceutical companies are charging Americans prices that are dozens of times higher than what they charge for the exact same drugs they sell in other countries. Americans are not only being overcharged, but many are forced to put their health at risk in order to balance their checkbooks. In the past year, 3 in 10 adults decided to forego taking their prescribed medications because of the cost. That is indefensible, and it is shameful for our nation. While consumers are making choices that could be hazardous to their health, drug companies continue to pad their profits for marketing and sales, executive bonuses, and stock buybacks, and raise prices with no end in sight. That's why I strongly support the amendment in the nature of a substitute, which would take a long overdue step toward empowering all Americans, whether they get their health care through Medicare or employers, to access fairly negotiated drug prices. The Health, Employment, Labor, and Pension Subcommittee held a hearing on H.R. 3 recently. During that hearing, I showed clips of Donald Trump agreeing with the American people that prescription drug prices are out of control. He called on Congress to do something and vowed that the White House would rein in the cost. Meanwhile, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle in this committee claim that cutting the cost of drugs will stifle research and innovation. But 9 out of 10 big pharmaceutical companies spend more on marketing, sales, and overhead than on research. With the significant savings achieved by getting American consumers a fair deal on their drug prices, we can invest billions of dollars where they belong, in the search for new treatments and cures, and in strengthening our community health centers, which are vital in serving our inner cities and rural community constituents. I hope all of you will join me, Republicans and Democrats, in supporting this amendment in the nature of a substitute to address the unsustainable and harmful cost of prescription drugs. And I yield back.
Thank you. The others wish to be heard. Gentlelady from North Carolina, Ms. Adams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word. Mr. Chairman, I speak in support of the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3, the Lower Drug Costs Now Act of 2019. On any given day, more than 30% of Americans will make a decision to forego taking their medication as prescribed because of its cost. Today in America, we see diabetics rationing their insulin. A vial of insulin costs on an average about $5 to produce, yet the list price of insulin has increased by nearly 400% since 2002, with some manufacturers charging as much as $540 for a single vial. Far too often, families have to decide whether they'll pay the mortgage, put food on the table, or buy their prescribed medicine for the month. And what's worse, compared to residents in other countries, Americans pay far more for the same drugs. In 2017, the U.S. spent $333 billion on prescription medication, up from $236 billion in 2007, an increase of more than 40% over 10 years. According to BBC News, in 2013, pharmaceutical companies enjoyed higher average profit margins than car makers, oil and gas companies, and media companies. Only banks had a profit margin comparable to Big Pharma. But I don't want to pin all the blame on the manufacturers. The entire prescription drug ecosystem is unsustainable. And so we have to take a closer look at rebates, at shareholder dividends, and stock buybacks, and other incentive structures that may have unintended consequences. I'm glad we're taking concrete steps forward to address the cost problem. House Democrats have proposed a bold set of reforms in H.R. 3. Under H.R. 3, the Secretary of HHS will have greater negotiating power to bring down the cost of prescription drugs, allowing the ecosystem to recalibrate. In this amendment to H.R. 3, I'm glad to see an increase in the number of drugs subject to negotiation, and that will continue to increase over time. And I'm pleased to see an effort to increase transparency by publishing maximum list prices, as well as a list of health plans and insurance companies that elect not to participate in this program. Our constituents are counting on us to provide relief, and we can't maintain the status quo. It's time to truly put patients over profits. And Mr. Chair, I urge my colleagues to support this legislation, and I yield back.
Thank you. The others wish to be heard. Gentleman from California, Mr. Takano.
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word. So I would like to applaud and recognize the efforts of Chairman Scott and others, other members on the negotiations and introduction of H.R. 3, the Lowering Drug Costs Now Act. The high cost of prescription drugs continues to be a top concern for individuals and families all over the country, including my constituents. For years, pharmaceutical companies have taken advantage of hard-working Americans. Healthcare costs in this country are exorbitant, and a critical piece of that pricey equation is prescription drug costs. The United States spends almost 4 times as much on prescription drugs than any other country. This is simply outrageous. H.R. 3 would pave the way for the Health and Human Services Secretary to directly negotiate with manufacturers on the prices of drugs, leveling the playing field for all American patients and taxpayers. This bill not only ends the blanket ban on negotiations, but also makes sure that drug companies must come to the table and negotiate in the first place, and also in good faith. Those on the other side of the aisle will try to steer this conversation away from real solutions to address a real problem. Rather than tackle the issue head-on, many my GOP counterparts on this committee will claim that this is a government takeover or a path down the road towards socialized medicine. This is simply not true. Hardworking Americans are choosing between putting food on the table for their families and filling their prescriptions. People should not have to ration their medicine because it is too costly to get a refill. This should not happen in the richest country in the world. The reality is that this bill will save taxpayers money. According to an initial estimate from the Congressional Budget Office, there will be a $345 billion savings in Medicare Part D. The Office of Actuary also recently reported the bill will save households $158 billion and private businesses $46 billion from 2020 to 2029. Now, this is common sense legislation that will lead to lower premiums, lower out-of-pocket expenses, and healthier families. It also boosts the economy and puts this money back into the pockets of those that need it the most, senior citizens and hardworking Americans. As members of Congress, we are tasked with presenting legislation and finding practical solutions to benefit every American, and that is exactly what this bill does. I urge my colleagues to vote yes on the amendment in the nature of a substitute, oppose any amendments that do not strengthen the legislation, and support the underlying bill by voting yes. Hardworking Americans all across the country are counting on us to pass this critical legislation. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Heard. Gentleman from New York, Mr. Morelli.
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for your leadership and dedication to making health care affordable for workers and employers alike. I'm pleased that this committee is considering legislation that recognizes we are facing a nationwide crisis around the skyrocketing cost of prescription drugs. Prescription drug companies are charging Americans prices that are 3, 4, or in some cases 10 times higher than what they charge for the same drugs in other countries. These inflated costs place a significant and dangerous burden on families, especially older Americans, who need an average of 4 to 5 prescriptions per month and are often on fixed incomes. In 2016, health plans sponsored by large employers spent a total of $83.9 billion on their plans' drug benefits, and the just 10 particularly high-priced drugs accounted for $14.8 billion of this spending. We cannot allow these exorbitant prices to go unaddressed. The Lower Drug Costs Now Act will address and reverse the skyrocketing cost of prescription drugs and ensure life-saving medications are accessible and affordable for all people. No American should have to ration or stop taking life-saving medication because they cannot afford its rising and grossly inflated cost. That is why this legislation is desperately needed today. While today we are considering Title I of H.R. 3, I'd like to highlight an important part which I strongly support. That provision would allow more seniors and people with disabilities to receive assistance through the Medicare Part D low-income subsidy. I look forward to advancing this legislation and decades of inequity and provide much-needed relief for families in the community I represent in Rochester, New York, and across the nation. I'm proud to support the Lower Drug Costs Now Act and look forward to the benefits it will bring to patients throughout our country, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. The others wish to be heard. Gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Klein.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Move to strike last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, or Mr. Chairman. I agree that the American people are frustrated about the high cost of health care, especially prescription drugs. They're calling on us to work together to solve these problems. And since I was elected last November, I've held over a dozen town hall meetings in my district where the rising cost of health care and prescription drugs is at the forefront of my constituents' concerns. However, I believe this legislation is the wrong approach. It was crafted behind closed doors and without valuable input or a collaborative committee process. Its drafting is the epitome of what the average American despises about Congress. It's also the wrong approach for several reasons that I thought would have become clear after the majority went down this road with Obamacare. The H.R. 3 requirement that the HHS Secretary to make HHS negotiated prices available to the commercial market requires an unprecedented government interference in the private market. However, price setting is not negotiation. The bill requires the government to dictate prices by threatening a 95% tax on companies that fail to comply. Countries that have adopted drug pricing systems similar to what is included in H.R. 3 face decreased access to new drugs, increased wait times for patients, and supply shortages. Finally, research and development of new treatments and cures will see significant reductions because of the higher tax. Make no mistake, government price setting leads to patient access restriction. We see this in the very countries that H.R. 3 attempts to emulate. From Australia, where there was only 41% access to new medicines launched since 2011, to 67% access in Germany, neither are no match to the U.S. current level at 100%. Even available medicines take an advantage of an average of 19 months longer to become available in Australia. According to a Department of Commerce report, current price controls in foreign countries suppress worldwide investment by up to 16% each year, and additional estimates found that proposals included in H.R. 3 could lead to over $200 billion in cuts in private investment over the next 10 years. In Virginia, H.R. 3 has the potential to decimate an industry that is an important employer and contributor to Virginia's economy. The biopharmaceutical industry supports nearly 41,000 jobs in Virginia and $10 billion in economic output annually. The biopharmaceutical sector's Virginia manufacturing footprint includes 8 plants involved in the production of human-used medicines, including one in my district that recently announced a significant expansion. H.R. 3 threatens the hundreds of jobs in my district related to this industry. There's no doubt that Congress must act to lower prescription drug prices to ensure people can afford the medications they need. But let's not go down the same road with prescription drugs that we went down with health insurance. That's why I'm the lead co-sponsor of the Terminating the Extension of Rights Misappropriated Act, or TERM Act, bipartisan legislation that would allow for the quicker introduction of generic medications to the marketplace by ending the practice of evergreening by pharmaceutical companies. I do not intend to support H.R. 3 as it stands before us currently, and I hope that we can find a better solution to lowering drug prices. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlelady from Pennsylvania, Ms. Wild.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word. In honor of our late colleague, Mr. Cummings, I must speak in support of H.R. 3, and I concur with my colleague, Ms. Davis, that the bill should be named in his honor. As most of us know, Mr. Cummings was a fierce advocate for the cause of lowering the price of prescription drugs. In the early days of this administration, Mr. Cummings was determined to find common ground and felt that the price of drugs was an area where we could find bipartisan consensus. I hope that in his honor, this committee will find it possible to accomplish what Mr. Cummings so wanted to see happen. When I hear my colleagues across the aisle attack H.R. 3 as not being a bipartisan work product, I just want to ask them, where is your work on prescription drug pricing from the years that you had the majority in the House, the Senate, and the White House? Non-existent. Stop protecting rich corporate executives and start thinking about your constituents. The days of putting profits over people must come to an end. When drug companies try to justify the exploding prices of prescription drugs, they often hide behind their fiduciary duty to make profits for their shareholders. But as members of Congress, we have a much more important shareholder, the most important one of all, the American people. And just so that we are clear, there is no justification for the outrageous drug prices that exist in the wealthiest nation in the world. Drug companies' devotion to the dollar ignores the fact that the American people have subsidized their industry for years. 75% of all drugs are developed in part by American taxpayer support, and drug company executives reap the benefits. And while these companies often spend more on marketing, lobbying, and sales than they do on research and development, the National Institutes of Health have devoted $900 billion in basic and applied research to support the development of new drugs. The fact that Americans help fund the development of prescription drugs, but spend more on these drugs than anywhere else in the world isn't just unfair, it is immoral. Let me be perfectly clear. My statement is not intended to be a condemnation of the scientists and the employees of these companies. I am talking about the executives and the lobbyists who have become rich on the backs of our citizens. One vial of insulin in America should not cost 10 times what it costs in Canada. People like my constituents, Danielle Thrapp and her son Brandon, and Mitchell Lennett and his daughter Carly, age 14, all of whom live in my district, should not have to worry about the price of insulin. Mitchell Lennett was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes at a very young age, and now his 14-year-old daughter, Carly, who was also diagnosed at a young age, also struggles with the disease. Mitchell's greatest concern is what happens to his daughter, Carly, when she turns 26 and is no longer eligible for his health insurance. People are dying because our system has failed them. Congress has failed them. That's why this bill is so important. H.R. 3 establishes a fair price negotiation program through which the Secretary of HHS can negotiate lower drug prices for the highest cost prescription drugs, including insulin, something other countries with far lower drug prices have long been able to do. It also requires drug companies to pay a rebate to the Medicare Trust Fund for any price increases that exceed inflation as measured by the CPI for urban consumers. And the bill provides long-needed reforms by capping out-of-pocket costs for Medicare beneficiaries. In short, this bill will make prescription drugs more affordable. Preliminary estimates from the Congressional Budget Office suggest that H.R. 3 will lower prices, increase the use and availability of prescription drugs, and improve people's health and well-being. And while saving lives should be considered priceless, the CBO's preliminary score suggests that this bill will also reduce federal direct spending for Medicare by $345 billion from 2023 to 2029. On October 25th, 2018, even President Trump complained about American drug prices by saying, "This happens because the government pays whatever price the drug companies set without any negotiation whatsoever." Even with negotiation, drug companies will make more money in the United States than anywhere else in the world, and therefore will continue to develop and sell their drugs here. I call on my colleagues to put politics aside, ignore the lobbyists, and pass this bill out of committee. Let's get this done. Thank you.
Does others wish to be heard? I've been advised that there are some other committees meeting at the same time, and Ms. Trahan seeks recognition out of order. If there are others that are in similar situations, if you just notify staff so that we can similarly call you.
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Ladies recognized.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Today, the committee considers a critical piece of legislation, H.R. 3, the Lower Drug Costs Now Act, which flips the status quo on a system that has pocketed billions off the backs of working families, families just like the one I grew up in. Daily, Americans are forced to choose between filling a prescription that would save their life or breaking the bank, not paying a utility bill, foregoing groceries, maybe even heat. Price gouging is so bad that 1 in 3 Americans report skipping doses due to cost, and millions more are slicing and dicing up their pills to stretch them out. Whenever I go home to the district I represent, I hear from constituents like Mary Garcia from Groton, Massachusetts, sinking in a system where seniors and patients are bearing the cost for growth and greed. When Mary found that she had MS, her doctor gave her the opinion of trying a dozen different medications to stabilize her condition. Now, those who understand MS know that it's an unpredictable and costly disease. Different medications will stabilize different individuals. In a country that prides itself on global leadership and advancement, Mary's choices are shockingly limited. Mary can't choose the medication that best treats her symptoms, but the one that her health insurance covers. If Mary were to choose the prescription that best fits her needs, she would spend over $100,000 annually. Her story is one that's all too familiar to me. My dad has MS, and I see the sacrifices that he and my mom make for his treatment and for his care. In her message to me, Mary said, "It is outrageous that we live in a country where prescriptions are so expensive that many people have to ration or skip doses of their medication just to afford it." Well, I agree with Mary, and I agree with my colleague from Pennsylvania. When our colleagues had the majority in the House, Senate, and the White House, they chose to side with pharmaceutical companies and with lobbyists over the Americans struggling with the price of medication. Well, it's time for this Congress to step in and deliver the antidote. Like so many other members of this body, I came to Congress with the intention of acting boldly for the people, to work on the issues and solutions that matter in their lives. We can pass legislation that allows the government to use its high bargaining power to put the American people first over the drug industry profits. I urge my colleagues to work together in strengthening H.R. 3 and support its final passage in order to deliver our promise to American taxpayers. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you. Others wish to be heard? I understand Mr. Levin also has another committee he needs to be at. You don't? Okay, gentlelady from Georgia, Ms. McBath.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
Ladies recognized.
The cost of health care in America is completely out of control, and one of the major drivers is the cost of prescription drugs. Time and time again, my constituents in my district tell me that it is a top priority for them, and you really can't blame them. These are life-saving medications, and people are having to make unthinkable choices and decisions about whether to purchase their medications or put food on the table or gas in their cars. The American people are sick and tired of seeing endless price increases, while pharmaceutical executives give out big bonuses and buy back lots of stock. And we need to find a different way. Drug companies often argue that we've already have a system in which prices are negotiated by health plans and pharmacy benefit managers, and therefore it's not needed for the federal government to negotiate directly. However, I can clearly see that the system, as it is currently designed, is failing thousands of patients in my district and millions throughout the country. This legislation takes very bold steps towards reducing the cost of prescription drugs. It will save taxpayers billions of dollars over the next decade. Let us be completely clear. It is taxpayer dollars and wages that go towards paying for these outrageous prescription drug prices, and it's time for Congress to say that enough is truly enough. And that's why I'm supporting this legislation, and I thank the chairman for bringing it forth, the Lower Drug Costs Now Act of 2019. Thank you for bringing it to this markup, and I just want to give a personal experience. I myself have a disease, glaucoma, which means if I do not have drops in my eyes every single day, I can absolutely lose my sight. And earlier this year, my doctor actually prescribed a different drug for my eyes because the eye pressure wasn't staying low enough. The cost of the new drug that she prescribed for me was $485 every 30 days. $485 every 30 days. Now, I have a livable wage, but there are people in this country that cannot afford prices like that for the very drugs they need to live on to survive. And so I would urge my colleagues, please support this legislation. It is timely, it's of the essence, and people's lives and their health depends upon it. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. Would the others wish to be heard? Gentlelady from Oregon, Ms. Bonamici.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for bringing this important legislation before the committee today, especially as we mourn the loss of our colleague, Mr. Elijah Cummings, who cared so much and worked so hard on this issue. May he rest in peace. Action to address skyrocketing prescription drug costs is long overdue, and I'm proud to be part of a committee that is tackling the issue in a meaningful way. I frequently hear from constituents about the escalating burden of paying for their medications. During our last district work period, I held 6 town hall meetings in 5 different counties across Northwest Oregon, and the issue of unaffordable drug prices came up at every single one of them. In Cornelius, Oregon, a gentleman named John held up a small tube of medication. He said he thought it was a mistake when he was asked to pay $138 out of pocket for 2 of these 30-gram tubes. Despite having robust insurance coverage, the list price for that drug was more than $250, and he was responsible for a 20% copay. John wrote to me with additional details. He said, "Why is this stuff so insanely expensive?" He wondered, is it costly to make? Is there no generic version? Is it cutting edge, brand new, needing to make back research costs? John did some research, and he found out that the ointment was patented back in 1968, and until 2014, it cost about $10 a tube. That's still the price in England. But in the United States, only one company sells the drug, and 5 years ago, the company raised its price about 4,000%. Now, John was fortunate that his situation was not life or death, and that he was not being forced to choose between life-saving medication and putting food on the table. Too many Americans are not so lucky. John concluded his letter by writing, "At what point does it get too outrageous? At what point is it too insane? At what point is it so bad that we actually decide to fix it? People are desperate and people are dying."
I couldn't agree more with what John said, and that is why I'm a co-sponsor of the underlying legislation and support the amendment in the nature of a substitute which will empower the largest purchaser of prescription drugs, the federal government, to negotiate prices just like private payers, who will also benefit from these negotiations. And here's my personal story. Thank you to Representative Macbeth for sharing hers. My mother's 91 years old. She's a 2-time cancer survivor, and she has Alzheimer's and was recently diagnosed with irregular heartbeat. She was prescribed a medication, and I got a call from the pharmacy when they were filling the prescription. They said, we just want you to know that the out-of-pocket cost for this prescription is more than $300 after payment by Medicare. Now, like Representative Macbeth, we're able to cover that cost, but what about the families who don't have an extra $300 a month to cover the cost of life-saving medication? H.R. 3 will lower out-of-pocket expenses, particularly for seniors, and will reinvest some of the hundreds of billions in dollars in savings back into developing new therapies and improving health care for all Americans. I urge my colleagues to join me in being part of this solution, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. The others wish to be recognized. Gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Levin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word. Mr. Chairman, I think every American family probably has a story about a time when high drug prices affected them personally. Let me tell you about one of mine. My 2 oldest sons live with Crohn's disease. They're 26 and 24, and they were diagnosed at 11 and 9. So it's been 15 years. One of the drugs that can treat Crohn's disease is Humira, and my sons have been on several of these drugs. But my son Saul took Humira for years when he was a little boy, and I'll never forget when he got big and brave enough to inject the drug into his thigh himself instead of having me do it. One of the things that I can tell you is that our family could never have afforded Humira without good health insurance. And just imagine the situation of American families today, of seniors on fixed incomes, of people without health insurance, or those with high deductibles or high copays for drugs. So Saul was being given Humira every 2 weeks, which is the most normal course. And he was a young teenage boy, and he wasn't growing. And his doctor, and I'm going to say his name because he's retired and he was so great, Bob Truding, he was the head of pediatric gastroenterology at Beaumont Hospital. He said, well, I'm going to do a little experiment. And he took Saul's inflammation markers after 1 week of taking Humira, and then after 2 weeks. And after 1 week, they were great. And after 2 weeks, they were horrible. It was like an 8th grade science experiment. But, you know, it was also, in a way, the best kind of empirical medical practice. So he put Saul on Humira every week. And Saul began... Sorry. Saul began to grow and flourish. We have so many families in our country who are rationing drugs. What if Saul couldn't have gone up to a higher dose than normal? He wouldn't have achieved his full biological height and weight and stature. So this is what we're actually talking about this morning. Let's talk about Humira. It costs about $19,000 a year in 2012. It costs more than $38,000 a year in 2018. There's absolutely no excuse for this price gouging by a monopoly, and it's outrageous. And it's happening in drug after drug. And that's why we have to allow Medicare to begin negotiating drug prices. In 2018, Humira brought in more revenue for its manufacturer than every NFL team combined. Families are struggling because Big Pharma is raising prices to pad their profits. And let me make one thing absolutely clear. They're not doing it to fund research and development. 9 out of 10 big pharmaceutical companies spend more on marketing, sales, and overhead than on research. Last year, Pharma broke its own lobbying record, spending $27.5 million to maintain the status quo that's hurting families in my district and across the country. Mr. Chairman, I'm not buying the usual talking points, and my constituents who are getting crushed by outrageous drug prices, they're definitely not buying them. The bill before us will move us forward. When we report it out of our committee today, we will take a long overdue step towards fulfilling our promise to our constituents and bringing down drug prices for America's families. I urge my colleagues to support H.R. 3, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. The others wish to be heard. Gentleman from North Carolina, Dr. Murphy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Following comments are going to be made really from 3 different perspectives. One as a parent whose child requires lifelong medication. So I agree with so many of the comments that my colleagues have made. The second is as a physician who for the last 30 years prescribes medications to patients, some of whom don't take them because they cannot afford them. And finally is as a member of Congress who answers to the people of my district and this entire nation. Listening to my colleagues, I agree with many of their comments. We are one out of two countries in the world that promotes direct-to-consumer advertising. Actually, 8 out of the top 10 pharmaceutical companies in the world, the number one expense is marketing. I believe in free speech and I believe in advertising. But simply allowing the American consumers to pay more for drugs for Super Bowl ads is something that I believe this nation needs to look at. Another component, pharmacy benefit managers, an entity that in this country that most consumers, most patients have no idea of, robs this country of so much money that goes to their pockets rather than to consumers' pockets is something that also needs to be dealt with and is not dealt with in this bill. I could go on, because from those 3 perspectives, I could probably give a lecture for 2 hours on this topic. But I think we need to do something about these problems, but I do not believe that H.R. 3 is the answer to these problems that face our nation. Why? I believe that the process that's been instituted here is similar to the farcical impeachment proceedings that are going on in the House right now. They stand in the face of the processes that have been established for this Congress on how bills and how legislation is passed. Number 2, the answer to every problem that faces the citizens in this nation is not another answer that is supplied by big government. Over the last 30 years as a physician, I have worked in many, many other countries, from India, from Africa, all over this world. And I will tell you that the picture painted by several in this country about how beautiful health care is in other countries is simply not true. We paint a picture, many paint a picture that people have free access to physicians, people have free access to medications. That is simply not true. As a physician, I'm held oftentimes to not being able to prescribe certain medications by preventions, by formularies put forth by pharmaceutical companies. I will tell you that in other nations where government has the control, the restrictions are far greater and the options are far less for patients. I will offer you this. I'm a new member to Congress, been here just barely a month. But as a physician, as a parent, and as a legislator, I am here to work with my colleagues, both Republican and Democrats, to actually put forth a comprehensive effort that builds upon facts
rather than emotions, purpose and resolve to put forth actually a truly comprehensive thing, issue, and legislation that can help this nation. Difficult decisions must be made, but they need to be done in a process that is collaborative, deliberative, and nonpartisan. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Chairman, for your time.
Thank you. Others wish to be heard? Gentlelady from Washington, Dr. Schreier.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, Dr. Murphy. I agree with your comments about direct-to-consumer advertising and PBMs. Those should absolutely be addressed. But today we're here to talk about H.R. 3, and I am excited about this bill. You know, I just listened to my colleague, Representative McBath, talk about her glaucoma drops costing $485 a month. And I bet that everybody in this room thought, like I thought at the same moment, gosh, I wonder what those cost in Canada. Because on average, we pay 3 to 4 times what our Canadian neighbors pay for the same exact medications. And that is exactly what this bill is addressing, the fact that right now we are subsidizing the world, we are making CEOs wealthy, we are making profits for Big Pharma, astoundingly huge, all on the backs of the people that we represent. And I don't imagine that my district is all that different from all of yours, that when I campaigned, the #1 issue I heard was about the cost of healthcare and the cost of prescription drugs. And I found that no matter what house I went to, it didn't matter if you were a Democrat or Republican, if you couldn't afford your medication and you couldn't pay your copays, you just wanted somebody to go to bat for you. And that is why they elected a pediatrician to Congress, because they knew that I would come here and I would do this. My personal story is that I'm a pediatrician. We live 3 hours from Canada. And I'm kind of tired of my patients having to drive up to Canada to buy their 3 EpiPen kits for the year so they can have 1 at home, 1 at school, and 1 in their own backpacks. I'm tired of hearing about my diabetic patients who have to go to Canada, and I myself have type 1 diabetes and have seen the cost of Humalog insulin go from $40 a bottle about 20 years ago to $300 a bottle now. My copays have gone from 20 up to 100, but imagine the people who are paying full price, either because they don't have insurance or they are underinsured or have high deductibles, and this hits them at $300 a month if they only use 1 bottle a month. So this has to change, because right now it's the people in our districts who are suffering, and this is egregious, and there is no justification for those kinds of price increases, just like there is no justification for the price increase in Humira. This negotiates the cost of prescription drugs based on already negotiated prices that are used in 6 other industrialized countries. We are not comparing these prices to Africa and other places where they get special discounts. We're talking about Germany and France and England, Australia, Canada, very comparable countries who use the same medications, and we know that these pharmaceutical companies already make a profit just charging those prices. So why should we be paying 3 to 4 times more? That is unconscionable. So last, I will mention the influence of Big Pharma here in Congress. There are 2 lobbyists from pharmaceutical companies for every 1 member of Congress. Think about that. Now think about the fact that each of us represents about 750,000 people in our districts. Who sent us here? And who do we have to answer to? It is certainly not Big Pharma. It is the 750,000 people who are counting on us to make their lives better, to make it so they don't have to choose between eating and taking their medication, to make it so those diabetics aren't rationing insulin at the end of the month and some dying because they can't afford it. So think about this, and I urge my colleagues to support this bill.
Thank you. Others wish to be heard? Gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Trone.
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your leadership that is directly benefiting the American people. Soaring prescription prices are crushing Americans at the pharmacy counter, driving up health insurance premiums, and creating unaffordable costs to taxpayers. 3 in 10 adults report not taking their medicines as prescribed at some point in the last year due to cost. In my state, Maryland, the list price for insulin is 21 times that in Australia. There's no good reason for this. Nobody should live in fear of health care costs. We can do better. I come out of the private sector. The largest 500 companies in America have a profit margin of roughly 7%. Yet, the largest 25 drug companies in America, with the lobbyists Congresswoman Schreier just spoke about, have a profit margin of 20%. We need to stop providing monopoly profits to the drug companies just because they hire the most lobbyists. I'm a proud co-sponsor of H.R. 3, the lower drug health care costs now. It'll lower costs, prescriptions across America with massive savings. $345 billion for Medicare, savings for Medicare beneficiaries of $126 billion in out-of-pocket costs. Private health insurance enrollees save $55 billion, and private employers save $46 billion. These massive savings pose an opportunity for reinvestment of dollars where they belong, advancing the opioid crisis and medical research. My friend and Maryland colleague, Elijah Cummings, spent his life devoted to those Americans with no voice. We worked together on the opioid crisis, this horrific epidemic that since 2000 has cost America $1.5 trillion and claimed over 400,000 American lives, directly fueled by the greedy drug companies. It's only right we devote some of the money saved in these drug costs to help the people impacted by some of these companies. We have an opportunity to be truly transformational if we channel these savings into prevention, education, and treatment. But also medical research. We have to drive innovation, and this can help us drive it stronger. At NIH, they fund 19% of the grant requests. That number should be 35%. The return on investment at NIH is over $8 for every $1 invested. Who would not spend 8 to 1 all day long? We need to think about our kids, think about the next generation, and think long term. We have to drive this innovation, identify new treatments and cures. That's why I support this bill. It's good for people. It's good for the economy. I urge a yes vote. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The others wish to be recognized? If not, there being no further discussion on the amendment and nature of a substitute, the committee will now move to consideration of further amendments. Unfortunately, no amendments were filed in time for priority consideration under the roster process, but I do appreciate the fact that we received this morning several amendments in time for evaluation, not as much evaluation as we could have had under the roster process, but I do appreciate the fact that they were not just sprung on us where there's no time for evaluation. We've been given a list of amendments that we expect, and we'll go down that list, beginning with the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Wahlberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
Gentleman seeks recognition for the purposes of amendment. The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Wahlberg and Mrs. Stefanik.
The gentleman's
Mr.
recognized.
Chairman, I reserve a point of order.
Point of order is recognized and reserved. Gentleman from Michigan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, governments don't negotiate, they dictate. The radical approach taken by H.R. 3 includes troubling and unprecedented government interference in private market negotiations, which will eliminate choice and competition and jeopardize innovation, investment, and access to future cures. One estimate found that if H.R. 3 were to go into effect, it could result in $100 billion in cuts to research and development, life-saving research and development. That means fewer breakthrough cures for difficult and rare cases. In addition, drugs that may be subject to negotiation are less likely to see investment since they will likely never be able to recoup the cost of development. Alzheimer's disease is a type of dementia that affects memory and cognitive abilities, and probably most of us in the room, myself included, have seen the impact on our loved ones or our friends and neighbors. The symptoms gradually worsen over time and include disorientation, mood swings, deep confusion, unfounded suspicions, memory loss, and difficult speaking, swallowing, or walking. Many individuals can lose their ability to live independently, carry a conversation, recognize loved ones, or respond to their environment. There is no cure yet for the 5.6 million Americans impacted by Alzheimer's disease, and if no treatments are found, care for patients with Alzheimer's could increase by $1.1 trillion by 2050. I've met with numerous people across Michigan's 7th District who are actively engaged in the fight to end Alzheimer's. Just last month, my wife and I took part in the Alzheimer's Association Michigan Great Lakes Chapter's Walk to End Alzheimer's in Adrian, Michigan. Finding a cure will lead to the first survivor of Alzheimer's is personal and an important fight for millions of people across the United States. At least $70 billion has already been invested in finding a cure for Alzheimer's disease and have resulted in 146 FDA pipeline failures. In particular, high-profile failures late in the clinical trial process have increased the risk and reduced the incentives of investing in Alzheimer's disease research. But there's hope. There always is. There are currently 74 medicines in early-stage development to treat Alzheimer's disease. One of these could be the cure we desperately need. This amendment exempts drugs that treat or cure Alzheimer's disease from the list of drugs eligible for negotiation and government price setting. If this amendment is adopted, it will ensure that necessary research to end this terrible disease for patients and families will not be endangered or stifled by H.R. 3. Preserving access to future medical breakthroughs is a crucial priority, and I urge my colleagues to support this amendment. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you. I recognize myself in opposition to the amendment to strike the last word. We've heard that if you reduce the price, you'll reduce the availability of research dollars. According to one study, the 18 drug companies in the S&P 500 index in 2016 and publicly listed for 10 years prior to that distributed 99% of their profits to shareholders over the decade, by 50% of it in buybacks and 49% in dividends. Reducing the price may reduce the profits, but it's not going to affect research and development, most of which is done at the NIH anyway. This amendment would exempt drugs that help Alzheimer's patients, effectively telling those patients and their families that they do not deserve to pay the lower prices for drugs that this bill will affect. I think that's unfair to those patients, and I therefore oppose the amendment. Are there any comments on the amendment? Gentlelady from New York.
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word. With 1 in 4 Americans struggling to afford their medications, we must push for bipartisan solutions to lower the cost of prescription drugs for patients and families. This was something that I heard about last week during my 4 town halls across New York's 21st Congressional District. Through good faith efforts on both sides of the aisle, real progress has been made to address this problem, including the passage of the 21st Century Cures Act and the reauthorization of the generic drug program. But we must do more more, and we must do so on a bipartisan basis. We must continue to advance solutions that promote competition in the marketplace while enhancing transparency and accountability in drug pricing. Guided by these principles, we can lower costs for patients and families without sacrificing innovation and stifling the hope for new cures and even better treatments. Instead of building on this bipartisan progress, H.R. 3 presents a radical proposal that threatens Americans' access to life-saving medication. Let's be clear here. Government price controls, take-it-or-leave-it offers dressed up as negotiations, and the threat of a 95% sales tax is a tax on innovation and a tax on life-saving cures. Initial estimates suggest that H.R. 3 would result in $100 billion in cuts to research and development, resulting in fewer breakthrough cures, particularly for the most challenging and the rarest of diseases. Every member of Congress has met with advocates or survivors who are advocating for that next life-saving drug. Further, drugs that may be subject to these price controls are less likely to see the necessary investment since they will never be able to recoup the high cost of development. And particularly for the 5.8 million Americans living with Alzheimer's disease, almost 500,000 from my home state, New York, we have treatments but no cure. Everyone in this room knows families that have been impacted by Alzheimer's. Many of our own families have been impacted by those suffering from Alzheimer's disease. And despite the $70 billion that has already been invested in developing a cure for Alzheimer's, many of these efforts have sadly come up short. Recent failures late in the clinical trial process have increased the risk and reduced the incentives of investing in Alzheimer's disease research. But what we do have for them and their loved ones is hope. Hope that the American spirit of ingenuity and innovation will ultimately deliver a cure. There are currently 74 medicines in early stage development to treat Alzheimer's disease, any one of which could be the cure that millions of families desperately need. This amendment exempts drugs that treat or cure Alzheimer's disease from the list of drugs eligible for government price controls. With the adoption of this amendment, we can ensure that ongoing research and development to end this devastating disease for patients and families will not be stifled by H.R. 3. Preserving access to life-saving innovation and medical breakthroughs is critical in our fight against Alzheimer's disease and so many diseases. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and I hope we can return to working together to focus on bipartisan solutions for the American people. I yield back.
Thank you. The others wish to be heard. Gentleman
Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from Connecticut. Well, gentlelady from Washington, Dr. Schreier.
Thank you. I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady's recognized.
I was recently at the Alzheimer's Walk with Alzheimer's patients and their families in my district, and it is a devastating and terrifying disease, and we all desperately want a cure and want to finance the pharmaceutical companies who are looking for this cure. However, I don't think that we can pick and choose certain diseases or certain medications to be excluded from charging a fair price. And a fair price is not price fixing, it's not undercutting Big Pharma. I have lots of pharmaceutical companies in my state and I want to support them. This just means you can't gouge American consumers, you can't charge us so much more than other countries, and it's a fair price, and that means it takes into consideration things like, is this a blockbuster drug? Does this do something no other drug's done before? Does it save countless dollars of taking care of Alzheimer's patients for years and years through this disease? How much research and development went into it? Those are all factors that need to be considered in coming up with a fair price. And frankly, this doesn't even come up unless a medication costs more than $58,000 per year. And so I don't believe, despite how scary and how devastating Alzheimer's disease is, I don't believe we can pick and choose some diseases over others and say that with those, a pharmaceutical company can charge whatever they want, because that may just happen, and we all need to be able to afford those treatments. A treatment is worth nothing if you cannot afford to buy it for your family member.
You heard, Gentlelady from Connecticut, Ms. Hayes.
I'd like to strike the last word
Gentlelady's recognized.
and associate myself with my colleague, Dr. Schreier. I remember my family was affected very closely by Alzheimer's, my grandmother, and we kept her at home and watched her just fade away until she was unrecognizable. And I remember when then candidate Trump was running for office, and as a teacher, I always try to figure out, you know, what can we agree on? What is the unifying factor that binds us together? And I remember he said that when the time comes to negotiate the cost of drugs, we're going to negotiate like crazy. And that made me hopeful. You know, I thought, we agree on this. So to be here today, coming into this committee, and to hear so much opposition is very confusing, because I thought the one thing that, well, not the one thing, but one of the things that we all agreed on that was that we needed to negotiate and bring down the prices of drugs. And I just want to finish by saying the Secretary is negotiating, not price setting, using information about what manufacturers are willing to sell their drugs for in other developed nations. Their profits will not change. The United States will continue to be the largest consumer, paying the highest prices, and their profits will not change. The margin, the profit margin may be slightly reduced, but we'll be able to offer more drugs to more people and keep more money in their pocket. And I just hope that we can get to a place where we're putting that first, because as we're sitting here talking about constituents and, you know, who we represent, I'm thinking of my neighbors and my friends and my family and my grandmother. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you. Others wish to be heard. Gentlelady from Michigan, Ms. Stevens.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady's recognized.
Thank you. We're here in a ringing moment of truth in the light of a true giant who moved to get us fairer drug prices for all Americans. And we here today, we carry his torch forward. And as we also recognize, we're almost 2 months to the end of this year, and the thankless and tireless efforts of this committee staff are really remarkable when we are doing the work of the people through the Rebuild America Schools Act, through the Butch-Lewis Act, the Raise the Wage Act, met with amendment after amendment, and their particular care and concern to detail is recognized. And that is also what makes this amendment particularly outrageous and egregious. Millions of Americans are suffering from Alzheimer's. Millions of American families are shouldering this burden. And one would hope that we would be investing and encouraging the investment in the basic research agenda to come up with those cures. And while we're at it, through H.R. 3, ensuring that we have affordable drugs for these patients. And so I urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment and to not single out those suffering from this terrible disease, as I think we can all agree we need to find a cure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you. Do others wish to be heard? Gentleman from Connecticut.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I withdraw my point of order and move to strike the last word and yield to the chair.
Thank you. We've heard two comments, one about the reduction in research that would be possible if this amendment doesn't pass. I'd point out that CBO scores this as a $345 billion savings to Medicare Part D alone, and $100 billion for businesses and consumers in addition to that, and they haven't finished finding savings. A lot of that savings will be reinvested into NIH for research. As I indicated, most of the profits in drug companies go to stock buybacks and dividends. The other point was made by the gentlelady from Connecticut. The availability will still be there. If they're making a profit in other countries, they're not going to give up the biggest market and at 120%, the highest price in the world. these drugs will still be available. So I would hope that that we would not adversely affect the patients who desperately need relief and deny them the relief that the Alzheimer's patients, and deny them the relief that this bill will provide. I yield back. Are there others that wish to be heard? If not, the question is on the amendment. All in favor of the amendment will say aye.
Aye.
All opposed will say no. No. Noes appear to have it.
Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman requests a recorded vote, and pursuant to the previous comments, that will be rolled. Are there other amendments? Gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Norcross.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3 offered by Mr. Norcross.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes on behalf of his amendment.
Thank you. This amendment is very simple, straightforward, and it's additional protection for consumers, particularly workers. H.R. 3 already helps achieve savings for workers and employer-sponsored plans. This one, that the Secretary negotiates the price, can simply apply to group health coverage. The bill also requires cost sharing to be based on the negotiated price so that these savings are passed on to the consumer. This is a simple amendment for further clarifies that if a plan is using the negotiated price, the co-payment may not exceed the negotiated price. Again, straightforward, very simple, and I hope my colleagues will join me in supporting this very simple amendment. I yield back.
Thank you. Anyone wish to be heard in opposition? If not, questions on the amendment. All in favor of the amendment will say aye. Aye. Wait a minute. Does the gentlelady wish to be heard on the amendment?
I do. Thank you,
Sorry.
Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, according to the White House, Mr. Chairman, Congress should embrace market forces, not price controls, to increase value to consumers. I noted that one of our colleagues a little while ago said that this is good old-fashioned market economics, this bill is. To me, that might bring a chuckle from most economists who hear us talking about price controls or threatening to interfere with stockholder dividends, the way corporations operate legally. We know that governments don't negotiate, they dictate. So according to the White House Council of Economic Advisors, generic drug approvals from January 2017 to July 2018 have saved $26 billion in drug costs. In 2016, Congress passed the 21st Century Cures Act, bipartisan legislation which accelerated discovery and development of new cures and treatments. Republicans, again, stand ready to work with Democrats to push for legislation that promotes competition and innovation and promotes new access to new life-saving drugs that otherwise wouldn't be discovered because of H.R. 3. This amendment does nothing to change government price setting. For that reason, I encourage my colleagues to vote no on the amendment.
Thank you. Are there others who wish to be heard? I recognize myself in support of the amendment. This amendment is a very simple amendment. It just guarantees that when you negotiate a good price, that your copay doesn't exceed the price of the drug. I think it's a reasonable amendment, and I would therefore yield back. Are there others who wish to be heard? If not, questions on the amendment. All in favor of the amendment will say aye. Aye. All opposed?
No.
No. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it. Next amendment is the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Allen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Allen.
The gentleman from Georgia is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. H.R. 3 poses a grave threat to innovation, research, development in the race to find new cures for hundreds of deadly diseases. H.R. 3 also has far-reaching economic consequences that will negatively affect jobs, the economy, and trade. This cannot be disputed. What you're creating here is a situation where the government is intervening in the economy, expecting to create savings for the consumer. Yet at the same time, you know, I've been here, this is my third term, and I have been asking this question. For every dollar that our taxpayers pay this government for health care, how much actually gets back to the patient for care? Now, I've heard speculation that is maybe 20 cents on the dollar. Do we wonder why health care costs are exploding? I mean, that's $240 billion. Now, what I would like for this committee to do is to get into the weeds here and figure out where the health care dollar is going. And as far as the pharmaceutical industry is concerned, you know, right now, it directly employs over 800,000 workers and indirectly supports an estimated 4 million jobs across the country. Now, one of the problems we're going to have here that needs to, you know, and again, folks, I'm just warning everybody here that, I mean, we saw what the Affordable Care Act did to health care. So what is this going to do to health care? So let me tell you why this amendment is on the table. China's growing power and economic aggression presents a threat to American jobs and national security. Recent cyber attacks, military crackdowns, and intellectual property infringement underscores these dangers. By diminishing U.S. private investment in research and development, H.R. 3 gives China additional incentives to further develop pharmaceutical manufacturing and innovation capabilities, which will put companies, patients, families in the United States at further disadvantage. China's documented quality control problems and tainted drug supply issues could put Americans who depend on these drugs at greater risk. This amendment requires the Secretary of Labor to certify that H.R. 3 would not result in investment in biotechnology moving out of the United States or American manufacturing jobs moving to China. So where do you think these pharmaceutical companies are going to go? An example of this is my brother has to take a medication. And in a very short time, he is on his third medication. Now, why? He talked to his pharmacist, and the problem was the first two medications, which were much cheaper, portions of that medication were produced in China, and the medication did not work. So that is the purpose of this amendment. So I ask that this amendment be considered by the committee. It truly cares about sustaining job growth and standing up for American workers and families, and the members should support this amendment. And I also would like to add here that what we're talking about is a huge percentage of the economy. And to quickly try to solve this issue is a huge mistake, and it's going to have repercussions. And I'm telling you, the American people want choice, and we need to make these choices affordable. And something's out of kilter here, and I really believe the government is in the middle of it. And I think if a certain amount of investigation was conducted here, we would find out where the cost is really coming from. And so with that, I yield back.
Thank you. Does anyone?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
The gentleman from Maryland is recognized for 5 minutes.
I'd like to speak in opposition to the amendment. This amendment prevents the bill from going into effect and thus preserves the unacceptable prescription drug price status quo that's harming Americans unless the Labor Secretary makes certifications regarding biotech and manufacturing jobs going to China. First off, let me break some bad news to my colleague. Despite enjoying virtually unregulated profits, as was mentioned, 20% profits for the top 25 pharmaceutical companies versus 7% for the 500 unregulated companies. on domestic pharmaceutical production has moved offshore with a vengeance. Many of the ingredients contained in medicine sold to U.S. consumers come from factories churning out pills and vials near Asian cities like Mumbai and Shanghai. Roughly 80% of the active pharmaceutical ingredients and 40% of the finished drugs are imported from abroad, according to the FDA. Basic drugs like penicillin are no longer produced in the U.S. Shifting production to China and India has made millions for the companies and their shareholders and led to the closure of American manufacturing plants. But these lower costs have not trickled down to U.S. consumers, who are still paying more than consumers anywhere else in the world for their drugs. Let's be clear, Americans who are having to make an awful choice between paying for the medications or their electricity bill don't need certifications from a labor secretary. They need solutions. That's why we're here today. This bill will fix a broken and unsustainable status quo with respect to skyrocketing prescription drug prices. Let's keep our eye on the ball, keep our eye on the prize. Let's reject this red herring amendment. Remember what's at stake. I urge my colleagues, oppose this amendment. I yield back.
Thank you. Are there other comments on the amendment? The question is on the amendment. All in favor of the amendment will say aye.
Aye.
All opposed will say no. Noes appear to have it. Gentleman from Georgia. Recorded vote is requested, and that will be rolled. Next amendment is recognize the gentlewoman from Massachusetts.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3 offered by Mrs. Strahan.
Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes on behalf of her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today I offer an amendment to H.R. 3 that would create a critical layer of accountability and transparency within this bill. My amendment is straightforward. It creates a statutory requirement for a study to be conducted by the Government Accountability Office to study and to report to Congress on the administration's implementation of the Fair Price Negotiation Program under Title I. The Fair Price Negotiation Program is a central tenet of H.R. 3. It grants the Secretary of Health and Human Services the authority, mandate, and tools necessary to meaningfully lower drug prices and deliver on our promises to consumers. While this negotiation program takes a transformational leap towards lowering prescription drug costs across our nation, we must hold this administration, as well as future administrations, accountable to the People's House. The GAO will have access to all necessary data to conduct its review and a report to Congress by the end of 2025. This will ensure that there is no unfair manipulation or gaming of the Fair Price Negotiation Program. My amendment shines a light on this process and ensures that we have the answers necessary to hold all actors accountable. H.R. 3 is a crucial step forward. It honors the promise we have made to the American people, and this amendment will help ensure we keep that promise. I urge a yes vote on my amendment and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. Are there others that wish to be heard on the amendment?
Mr. Chairman.
Ranking Member Fox is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wish to speak in opposition to the amendment. The proposed amendment by my colleague from Massachusetts requires a GAO study on H.R. 3's government interference in private market negotiations. However, rather than request a study before the bill is implemented, the study is required to be finished by September 2025. Let me repeat that. The Democrats don't want to know the effects of this bill for another 5 years. Yet another Democratic attempt to pass a bill without knowing what's in it. You know, that quote has been quoted a lot that Speaker Pelosi made at the time that we passed another famous bill. And the American people are continuing to suffer from that legislation. We ought to know what's in a bill before we pass it. So let me shed a little light on what we already know about Nancy Pelosi's price-setting scheme. H.R. 3 will eliminate choice and competition and jeopardize innovation, investment, and access to future cures. It really reminds me of that bill that was passed in 2009. This is not a risk I'm willing to take. I'll be voting no on this amendment and encourage my colleagues to do the same. I yield back.
Thank you. I recognize myself in support of the amendment. We've heard a lot of comments about the Affordable Care Act. I'll admit that it's not perfect, but I will point out that the replacement bill for the Affordable Care Act that was actually passed the House was scored by CBO. It said that if that bill had become law, the cost would go up 20%. 20-some million fewer people would be insured. Those with pre-existing conditions would start losing much of their protections, and the insurance you get is worse than what you got. CBO has also scored this bill, showed $345 billion savings to Part D alone. This study will just make sure that we're taking full advantage of everything we can to make sure those prices are going down, and if the bill needs to be tweaked here or there, we'll have that information. But the CBO has already scored it. We know exactly what it's going to do. It's going to save businesses and consumers $100 billion, save Medicare Part D, and keep the cost down a little above the international rate, but a lot lower than what they're paying now. So I would hope that we would adopt the amendment. Are there other comments? If not, the question is on the amendment. All in favor will say aye. Aye. All opposed, no.
No.
Ayes appear to have it. Ayes have it. The amendment is adopted. Are there other amendments? Gentleman from South Dakota, Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Mr. Chairman, I reserve a point of order.
Point of order is reserved. Gentleman from South Dakota.
Thank you very much. So as we know, H.R. 3 requires the Secretary of Health and Human Services to set prices for the most expensive drugs in the Medicare program each year. And as has been mentioned by some of my colleagues, those set prices are then available to others in the private market to be able to use if they want to, and they don't have to. It's voluntary. My amendment, which I suspect you can see is very small, would just make sure that that flexibility, that voluntary opting in on the part of the private sector is indeed voluntary, that it's a real and legitimate option for them. Employers are, particularly large employers, I think we all know, can be sophisticated purchasers of healthcare goods and services. And I think H.R. 3, I think, has a lot of problems, but if the majority is to be taken at their word, that H.R. 3 would be able to drive down costs, and those prices may be attractive to some employers. It may not be attractive to other employers who think that maybe they can do a better job. When I was chief of staff in South Dakota, I had a special responsibility over the state employee health insurance plan. We had 26,000 covered lives, and it was not unusual at all for us to be able to negotiate better rates for health care than, in some instances, even the federal government was able to get. Now, ERISA, which is a special part of the jurisdiction of this committee, plan fiduciaries must act in the best interests of their plan participants. They have a special duty of loyalty. They have to act with care and skill, with prudence and diligence. This is a high standard. It's a serious standard. It's a good standard. And so the amendment before this committee would just make it clear that nothing in H.R. 3 would disrupt or inadvertently impact that special ERISA standard. And I do think it's important that we make sure that there aren't unintended consequences from H.R. 3 with regard to this central part of this committee's jurisdiction.
Thank you. Does anyone wish to be recognized on the amendment? If not, I'd recognize myself to strike the last word in opposition to the amendment. I appreciate the concerns raised by my colleague, but I believe the amendment is unnecessary. The benefits of H.R. 3 to employers are substantial and makes it hard to believe the bill will have any adverse impact on employers. According to the Office of Actuary at CMS, savings to private businesses will total about $46 billion over 10 years. To depict the bill as burdensome is simply inconsistent with the fact that they're going to save a lot of money. In addition, the amendment has possible harmful effects on consumers by limiting the remedies that are available to workers enrolled in a group health plan. It could undermine the effectiveness of the bill to lower drug costs to a lot of consumers. Some of the most important provisions of ERISA, the Employee Retirement Income Security Act, are those which govern the actions of fiduciaries. They have to act in the best interest of plan participants. This amendment could call into question the application of these protections for workers with respect to the terms of drug price negotiation programs. This specifically signals out ERISA that allows workers, it singles out the provision in ERISA that allows workers to bring an action against a fiduciary who breaches the duty to act in their best interests. That change, we don't need to eliminate that potential action, because if a fiduciary is not acting in the best interest of the consumers, they need to be able to actually enforce their rights. This amendment would suggest that workers do not have the right to actually enforce the violations of their consumer protection under this bill, and that is that the fiduciary has to act in their best interest. So I appreciate the concerns, but I think this would weaken the bill, and therefore I would oppose the amendment. Gentleman from Tennessee.
First of all, I want to clarify on CBO. I've been here almost 11 years, and I've yet to see one CBO estimate that was correct. I'd like, if you've got it, please bring it to me. I'm waiting for it. The Affordable Care Act was supposed to have 24 million people. It's about 9, I think, in this current fiscal year. And to Mr. Johnson's comment, let me bring you to the real world when government negotiates prices. I remember one time, it's been many years ago, I'm an OBGYN doctor, and we did a big practice, did lots of pap smears. So we negotiated a price with the pathologist that was lower than what Medicare paid. But it's against the law to do that. So all of our patients had to pay more because of a Medicare rule that said we couldn't find a private business that would actually pay less. In other words, we paid them less. So think about that when you're doing these things. It's a simple thing that he's asking for, and out in the real world where I live for over 30 years, that's what actually happened when government got involved. It actually cost my patients more money. If they had just stayed out of the way, it would have been cheaper for our patients. I yield back.
Chairman yields back. Are there other comments on the amendment? If not, the question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from South Dakota. All in favor of the amendment will say aye. Aye. All opposed say no. No. The noes appear to have it.
Mr. Chairman, I would ask for a recorded vote.
The gentleman asked for a recorded vote, and pursuant to the previous comments, that will be rolled. The next amendment is offered to be offered by the gentlelady from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3 offered by Ms. Jayapal.
Gentlelady's recognized for 5 minutes on behalf of her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My heart is heavy this morning with the passage of Chairman Elijah Cummings. Chairman Cummings was an inspiration to so many people, a giant among men, and a personal inspiration and deep support to me when I first joined Congress. That never stopped, because that's really who he was. He had a moral integrity and clarity that just pierced through the noise of everything else that we often see here in Congress. And I think, Mr. Chairman, he would be so proud of what we are doing in this committee today with this bill. I want to thank Congresswoman Shalala for co-sponsoring this amendment. My amendment would limit pharma's ability to spike drug prices for the hundreds of millions of Americans covered by group health plans or insurance coverage. Specifically, my amendment would require the Secretary of Labor to determine the feasibility for an inflation rebate structure that can be used under group health plans and group health insurance coverage, and for the rebates to go back to patients and the plans who paid for those drugs. Should the Secretary of Labor find the plan to be feasible, then they will promulgate regulations for the program by the end of the year 2022. This amendment brings these group health plans and inflation rebate structure just as we have in the rest of H.R. 3. As it stands, too many of big pharma manufacturers enjoy monopolistic market power, and they sell prices as high as they possibly can. Consequently, many of their drugs launch with huge price tags, leaving American consumers to bear the brunt of this cost and putting lives at risk. It is critical for us in Congress to put an end to skyrocketing drug prices. The drug industry has gone unchecked for far too long, and Americans are hurting because of it. It's a matter of great pride for me to see the strong efforts of our caucus to take on this issue and the progress that we have made with this foundational proposal to address drug pricing in this country. I appreciate that my colleagues across the aisle want to have this be a bipartisan proposal, and I would just remind them that in the entire last Congress, there were no big proposals to take on this issue from the other side. It's past time for us in Congress to put an end to skyrocketing drug prices through direct negotiation with manufacturers to lower those drug prices for all Americans. The American people deserve a bold and effective proposal that matches the scale of the drug pricing crisis that we are facing. We have a responsibility to protect patients from price gouging techniques of Big Pharma. When CEOs hike prices for life-saving drugs by 400%, they're not doing anything illegal right now. They're maximizing their profits within a system that allows them to do whatever they want. That's why I'm glad to see that H.R. 3 includes an inflation rebate structure that would address the astronomically soaring prices of drugs. However, it's only good if the patient is lucky enough to be on Medicare. As the bill stands, patients not on Medicare and instead on group health plans or insurance coverage, which is 59% of workers in this country, do not have the same type of price spike protection. That leaves space for pharma companies to game the system and charge patients inflated prices, while the 15% of patients who are lucky enough to be on Medicare could get the lower price drug. When there's money left on the table, Mr. Chairman, I believe that Big Pharma is sure to grab it. The other day I spoke to Rachel, a constituent of mine. Rachel has multiple sclerosis. Since she started taking her drugs over the past decade, she has seen her drugs rise from the already astronomical amount of $50,000 to $75,000. She doesn't have Medicare, and instead she relies on her husband's group health plan. It's patients like Rachel that we aim to protect from these egregious price spikes. No other industrialized country allows drug manufacturers such extreme price-setting power, a power that Big Pharma has shown us time and time again that they will continuously abuse, even with people's lives at stake. By supporting my amendment, we'll strengthen H.R. 3 to do what it was designed to do, and that is lower drug prices for all Americans now. I urge my colleagues to support the amendment, and I yield back.
Thank you. Anyone else to be recognized? Gentlelady from North Carolina, Ranking Member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, the proposed amendment would require a study on what we already know. Inflation rebates further reduce development of new medicines and limit patient access to treatment. Employers are savvy market consumers that negotiate effectively. By enacting inflation rebates for group health plans, this further limits plan sponsors' abilities to manage drug spending and lower costs for workers. Instead of discouraging employer-sponsored plans from providing high-value coverage for their participants, Congress should promote market-based solutions that drive down costs and expand access to life-saving drugs. For that reason, I encourage a no vote on the amendment, encourage my colleagues to do the same. I yield back.
Thank you. Other comments on the gentleman from New Jersey?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Savvy negotiators. Absolutely. Private industry does a great job on that. In fact, as part of my local unions negotiating with healthcare companies for about 37 years. Savvy. That's why we're so savvy with those drug companies. For a psoriasis medicine, we pay $2,500 a dose here in the U.S., $422 in those other countries. That's real savvy. All the great power of every business trying to negotiate, and this is what we get, a 576% difference. You go to buy a truck, go buy a car, what's the first thing we do? We negotiate. But negotiations change a little bit when you're buying a car because you don't need a car to live. Many of the drugs we're talking about today is a life and death decision. We get reports of those patients who can't afford to take their drug or cut down by a third, by half, or don't take it at all. We see what happens when they don't take it. The outcomes are bad and worse and end up eventually in death, costing us more money. So negotiations, if you have a fair playing field, are rather straightforward. But when you negotiate with your life on the line, it's a big difference. This is why when we're talking about this bill and this amendment in particular, to move so those in the private sector can get the very same set of prices that the Secretary will negotiate. We negotiate each and every day. Now we need to negotiate as if our life depends on it, because it does. I yield back.
Thank you. The other comments on the amendment? If not, question is on the amendment. All in favor of the amendment will say aye. Aye. All opposed, no.
No.
The ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it. The amendment is adopted. The next amendment is the ranking member, Dr. Fox.
Thank you, Mr.
Have an
Chairman.
amendment at the desk. Clerk will,
Mr. Chairman.
clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mrs. Fox.
Gentleman from Connecticut.
Mr. Chairman, I reserve a point of order.
Point of order reserved. Gentlelady from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, H.R. 3 requires the Secretary of Health and Human Services to dictate prices for the most expensive drugs in the Medicare program each year. These prices must also be available to plans in the private market, but plans have the option whether to use these rates or not. In addition, if a plan chooses not to use these rates, it must report this decision to the Secretary. The Secretary is then required to publish a, quote, shame list of employers that do not use the government price control rate. However, employers are savvy healthcare consumers and make complex plan decisions for their employees every day. While these government-mandated rates may be attractive to some employers, others may feel they can achieve better rates on their own negotiations. This amendment requires employers to report to the government only if they use a price that is higher than the HHS government price. Employers should not be publicly called out for making responsible decisions for their employees, and they should not be subjected to the wrath of special interest groups and activists for making a responsible and informed choice. If H.R. 3 represents a true voluntary choice for employers, then Democrats should have no problem voting for this amendment. I urge everyone to vote for it, and I yield back.
Thank you. Gentlelady from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move to strike the last word.
Ladies recognized.
Yes, I want to speak in opposition to the amendment, and certainly I appreciate my colleague's concern for businesses, for her arguments inconsistent, though, with reality. In truth, H.R. 3 saves private businesses, resulting from $46 billion from 2020 to 2029, according to the Office of the Actuary at CMS. To depict the bill as burdensome on employers is simply not true. And by providing that group health plans and health insurance companies do not have to provide the public with information regarding the decision not to participate in the Fair Price Negotiation Program under H.R. 3. This amendment will deny important information for the American people regarding their health coverage. At its core, H.R. 3 is about lowering drug prices for the American people. This is accomplished by giving the Secretary of Health and Human Services the authority, the mandate, and the tools to ensure that American people are getting a good deal on their prescription drugs. The amendment would remove a crucial tool that the Secretary needs to lower drug prices, and that is the tool of transparency. So if we adopt this amendment, we're essentially saying to American consumers that they do not deserve to know whether their health plan is working to achieve the lowest price for prescription drugs. And so in view of those things, Mr. Chairman, I urge my colleagues to oppose the amendment.
Thank the chairman. I mean, this is a very simple amendment. I'd like to know in my business what business it is of government if I go ahead and negotiate a lower price. And I've already seen this happen in my own practice where we negotiated the lower price for a test that we did, and we couldn't do that because Medicare forced us to accept the government price, which cost my patients more money. And I would like to know what business it is of government. If I negotiate in my business a better price, that's my business, not the federal government's business. If they can't negotiate better than that, then they shouldn't be in the negotiating business. So I don't understand why everybody wouldn't support this. If you've ever run a business, this is just another layer of bureaucracy that adds to costs. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. The others wish to be recognized. Recognize myself in opposition to the amendment. The fact is that any burden on the employers is the burden of what to do with all those savings that they're going to generate by passage of this bill. Tens of billions of dollars saved to employers, tens of billions more to consumers, and $345 billion all over 10 years to the Medicaid Part D program. I would hope that we would have that you can possibly come up with one example of a lower price than is negotiated, but what we're dealing with are prices 2, 3, 5, 10, as many as 60 times more of what they're selling at a profit in other countries. And those are the prices that we're trying to get on behalf of the American people, and CBO has scored that as a significant savings to the American people, and that's what we're trying to achieve by this bill. I yield back. Other comments? If not, the question is on the Fox amendment. All in favor will say aye. Aye. All opposed say no. No. Noes appear to have it.
Mr. Chairman, we request a recorded vote.
The recorded vote is as requested. The next amendment, gentleman from California, do you have an amendment?
Yes.
Gentleman from California has an amendment at the desk. Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 3 offered by Mr. Harder. Mr. Trone.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes on behalf of his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is a short and simple clarification to ensure that any additional data collection requirements under the bill, where possible, are coordinated with other existing data collection efforts. This goes to some of the comments that my colleagues have said on the other side of the aisle about making sure that there's no unintended consequences coming from this bill, and indeed that we're trying to make sure the reporting and data collection efforts are as simplified as possible. Increasing transparency is a central aim of what we're trying to do here, and it's imperative that the secretaries have all the information needed to administer the negotiation program effectively and to ensure that consumers can achieve those cost savings in their prescription drugs. And this is why this legislation grants this additional authority to collect the data in the first place. We need it in order to negotiate well, but we have to make sure that these existing data collection efforts are not duplicative of what already exists. And this is going to make sure that those, whenever possible, those secretaries coordinate the additional data collection to minimize unnecessary reporting. I hope my colleagues can join me in supporting this simple amendment, and I yield back the remainder of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Are there Comments on the amendment? Gentlelady from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, the proposed amendment by my colleagues from California and Maryland fails to address the fundamental problems with H.R. 3. While the underlying amendment is not objectionable, it does nothing to stop the radical provisions of this bill from going into effect. Speaker Pelosi drafted this partisan bill in secret without member input on the collaborative committee process or the collaborative committee process. We should work together to put forward legislation to lower costs, promote competition, and establish transparency and accountability in drug pricing. We stand ready to work with our colleagues on bipartisan solutions, and I yield back.
Thank you. The other comments on the amendment? If not, the question is on the amendment. All in favor of the amendment will say aye. Aye. All opposed say no.
No.
The ayes appear to have it. The ayes have it. The amendment is adopted. The next amendment, gentlelady from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady has an amendment at the desk. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mrs. Fox.
Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from Connecticut.
Mr. Chairman, I reserve a point of order.
Point of order is reserved. Gentlelady from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today, we're discussing the threat that H.R. 3 poses to innovation and research and development. H.R. 3 also has far-reaching negative economic consequences that will affect jobs, the economy, and trade. The pharmaceutical industry directly employs over 800,000 workers in the United States and indirectly supports an estimated 4 million jobs across the country. Preliminary analysis of H.R. 3's economic impact found that over 1 million jobs could be permanently lost if this bill were to become law. Many of these jobs are high-wage manufacturing, construction, and STEM occupations that drive our economy. These workers are our constituents and community leaders. Their families depend on them for support, and patients depend on them to create the important drugs that will prolong or save their lives or make their quality of life better. This amendment requires the Government Accountability Office, GAO, to conduct a study to determine how many jobs would be lost if H.R. 3 were enacted. If more than 50,000 manufacturing, construction, research and development, and scientist jobs would be lost, the bill would not go into effect. If this committee truly cares about sustaining jobs and standing up for workers, the members should support this amendment. I yield back.
He yields back. Is anyone seeking recognition? Gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Underwood.
I move to strike the last word and speak in opposition to the amendment.
Gentlelady is recognized.
There is no credible, independent research to suggest that this bill will result in the loss of jobs. This argument is straight from the pharmaceutical industry's scare tactic playbook. I heard it myself directly from them yesterday, and my Republican colleagues are unfortunately following along. This is not the only instance of a big, powerful industry using scare tactics to deter from important reforms the American people are crying out for. The energy industry often maligns clean air and clean water rules as, quote, job killers. We're not going to fall for it. The American people are not going to fall for it. The simple fact is too many Americans struggle to afford life-saving prescription drugs. Nearly 1 in 3 U.S. adults report not taking their medicines as prescribed because of cost. As a nurse, I know this is incredibly dangerous for a patient's health and their well-being. H.R. 3 will put money in the pockets of patients who will pay less at the pharmacy counter and will have more to spend on other priorities for their families. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services Office of the Actuary found it will save American families $158 billion. Employers will also save on the cost of the health benefits they provide to their employees and can invest that savings in workers in the form of higher wages or new jobs. Again, the CMS, Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services Office of the Actuary found that key aspects of H.R. 3 will save private businesses $46 billion. Let's be clear here. My colleagues' arguments that jobs will be decimated are completely overstated. Under H.R. 3, the U.S. will remain the biggest market for pharmaceutical products. The pharmaceutical industry is one of the most profitable industries in America. Just this week, one of the largest drug companies announced quarterly profits of 23.3%. They could afford to buy back over $52 billion worth of shares following their windfall from the Republican tax law. We are not falling for these scare tactics. H.R. 3 will lower drug prices for patients, a critical reform the American people have asked for and that they deserve. And with that, I yield back.
Anyone else seek recognition on the amendment? Gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Chairman. Chairman, the Pelosi drug pricing plan would transform the market-based system that has made the U.S. the global leader in developing innovative, life-saving treatments and cures for patients. That's been something that's been important to me in 28 years of my rehabilitation practice. I worked with thousands of individuals facing life-changing disease and disability. This proposal combines multiple far-reaching and misguided policies that threaten to devastate the research-based biopharmaceutical industry, shatter the U.S. research and development ecosystem, and permanently retard the introduction of new medicines. And in addition, the proposal could lead to the shifting of jobs overseas and the loss of jobs across the U.S., including what's estimated a loss of roughly 45,000 Pennsylvania jobs and $12 billion in annual economic output for the Commonwealth. You know, I have a document that I want to submit, ask unanimous consent to submit for the record.
Without objection.
The data points, and I won't go through all these point by point. There's a lot of them here, but these data points demonstrate the enormous economic benefits and scientific leadership that the biopharmaceutical sector brings to Pennsylvania, and Pennsylvania can't afford to lose, nor can patients who are looking for cures afford to lose the research and development ecosystem, and quite frankly, the jobs and manufacturing base that are seriously threatened by the Pelosi price control scheme. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The other gentleman from New Jersey.
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Innovation, jobs, things that we certainly can agree on both sides of the aisle. But when we want to talk about loss of jobs and productivity in pharmaceuticals, let's not forget 50,000 people a year are dying from the opiates that these companies are pumping out into America. 50,000 people dying. That means their jobs are dying with them, their productivity. But the other side of the coin is innovation, and I've heard repeatedly that somehow we're stymied. Congress funded NIH $40 billion in 2019. $40 billion 1 year. NIH funding contributed directly or indirectly to the development of all 210 new drugs approved by the FDA between 2010 and 2016. We used to have something called reasonable pricing. I talked about this in previous hearings, that we as Americans are making huge investments, billions of dollars each and every year that the drug companies are using for their new medications. And are we getting a price break? Are we getting an investment that pays back? 576% increase if the drug is here in America. Humira, Enbrel, another arthritis and psoriasis. 467% more in America than the rest of the world. So for your $50 billion investment, what are we getting back? We're getting back higher prices, yet they're still taking the research that we are funding as Americans. That's where the real innovation starts. It's through American investments. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The others wish to speak on the amendment? If not, question is on the amendment. Excuse me, I'm sorry. Gentlelady from Connecticut, Ms. Hayes.
Mr. Chair, I move to strike the last word.
Lady's recognized.
Drug companies are charging Americans sometimes up to 10 times more than they charge for the exact same drugs overseas. For context, Humira, the average international price is $422. In the United States, $2,436. Enbrel, the average price internationally is $256. In America, $1,196. Stelara, the average price internationally is $3,341. In America, $16,597. This is unacceptable. Big pharmaceutical companies are taking advantage of loopholes and bankrolling themselves off the backs of hardworking Americans with inflated drug prices. It is unacceptable that families are being price gouged at the pharmacy counter and forced to make the impossible decision to either pay for their medication or put food on the table. I've spoken to constituents all around my district, and I can confirm that ever-rising cost of health care, led by seemingly exponentially rising drug costs, is a major concern to both my Democratic and Republican constituents. I have pharmaceutical companies in my district and in my state, and I understand how its employees make meaningful contributions to the communities they live in every day, and how many of those companies are good partners in the community. However, the argument we are hearing today that this common sense, long overdue bill will cause job losses for pharmaceutical companies is just wrong. A cheap and duplicitous claim meant to scare people and dissuade us from substantial change. The reality is backed up by math and economics. The partial CBO score we received predicts that H.R. 3 will boost the economy by putting over $345 billion back into the pockets of countless seniors and hardworking Americans. My colleagues want to talk about family economics and jobs, then let's talk about it. Let's talk about the families that work several jobs to afford an EpiPen for their child. Let's talk about the grandparents who are unable to afford insulin they so desperately need. I've been working closely with my colleagues to help lower drug costs for some of the most vulnerable members of our population. Just last week, we introduced a bill that would save these seniors money and improve access to medication. I'm happy to see that this proposal is likely to become included in H.R. 3. This groundbreaking bill gives Medicare the tools to achieve real price reductions and will incentivize more responsible pricing by drug companies. It creates new out-of-pocket limits on drug costs for Medicare beneficiaries, so no one has to go bankrupt to pay for health care. Under our current system, each family makes their own cost-benefits analysis. Can I afford to pay for these medications? But I think, more importantly, we hear the answer to everything is jobs. We're sent here to represent people. You know, and we have people who are potentially dying because they cannot afford life-saving medications. When we talk about the environment, it's, the economy. The answer to everything is the economy. So in a country with the best economy in the world, where businesses are thriving and production is at its best, why can't we serve the people? Why can't we go back and fulfill the promises that we made, on both sides of the aisle, to lower the cost of prescription drugs, to make sure that our communities are protected, to make sure that Americans receive high-quality health care? I just don't understand how we keep coming back to this place of just a line in the sand. And, as an adult and as a legislator, I refrain from name-calling and finger-pointing. But just as a mother and a friend and a sister, I think we have to do better. We have to do better by our children, by our communities, by our families, and really make this work. Mr. Chair, with that, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Thank you. Are there others who wish to be recognized on the amendment? Gentleman from California, Mr. Takano.
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word. I want to speak in opposition to this amendment. Lowering the cost of pharmaceutical jobs will not cause massive job loss. There is no evidence or research suggesting that jobs will be lost. And I urge my Republican colleagues to stop using farmers' recycled talking points. As I stated earlier, this bill boosts the economy and puts this money back into the pockets of those that need it most, seniors and hardworking Americans. Employers will pay less for health care freeing up money that can and should be used to hire more people. The only thing that is threatened by H.R. 3 is the amount of money that CEOs of pharmaceutical companies will take home each month. Let's be clear. My Republican colleagues claim that they care about workers, but this amendment is not about workers. It's about protecting pharma. I say that workers are protected by ensuring that they are not spending all of their take-home pay on high-cost pharmaceutical drugs. I urge my colleagues to vote no on this amendment. Thank you, and I yield back the best of the
Thank you. The others who wish to be recognized? If not, the question is on the amendment offered by the gentlelady from North Carolina. All in favor of the amendment will say aye.
Aye.
All opposed will say no. No. Noes appear to have it.
Mr. Chairman, could we have a recorded vote?
The recorded vote is requested and will be held at the end. Are there other amendments, gentlemen from North Carolina?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Gentleman has an amendment at the desk. Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Walker.
Mr. Chairman, reserve a point of order.
The point of order is reserved by the gentleman from Connecticut. Gentleman from North Carolina is recognized on behalf of his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am proud to offer an amendment today to highlight the significant impact H.R. 3 will have on companies' abilities to carry out research and development, leading to innovative medical advancements. My amendment is rather simple. It asks the GAO to conduct a study of how H.R. 3 would reduce the supply of capital for research and development. And here's the thing. If GAO determines that research and development in investments will decrease by over $10 billion annually, H.R. 3 would not go into effect. See, without this vital research, American patients would not have access to new life-saving drugs. The drastic decrease in research and development is just one of the negative effects that result from the passage of H.R. 3. This harmful legislation will impose total government control over our prescription drug industry, crippling market competition. And under this legislation, contrary to what is being said, there is no negotiating involved. The Secretary of HHS will have unilateral authority to determine drug prices and can impose financial penalties, including a tax of up to 95% on gross sales if manufacturers do not comply to this government entity. This effectively holds companies hostage to government demands and rate setting. I want to make it clear that I'm not advocating for us to ignore the serious problem Americans are facing with increased drug prices. And being completely transparent, there are some good points made with my friends across the aisle here. However, I would also ask my colleagues across the aisle to work with us to find bipartisan solutions as opposed to additional or more bureaucratic control that's being considered today. Passage of H.R. 3 will have a lasting negative impact across the country. Now, this is not a scare tactic, but to put things in perspective, in my home state of North Carolina, H.R. 3 will cost up to 45,000 jobs and $13 billion in annual economic output. By limiting innovation, reducing access to medication, delaying access to care, and tying domestic policies to other policies abroad, we are putting American patients at risk. So, I encourage my colleagues to support this amendment to protect the future of medical developments. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. And someone would seek to be recognized. Gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Shalala.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word and speak in opposition to this amendment. With all due respect,
5 minutes.
With all due respect to my colleague, Americans are already at risk. They're making choices about paying for their medications or putting food on their table, and they don't need another study. They need action. And that's why we're here, and that's the importance of this bill. I also want to make it very clear that there is explicit language in the bill that ensures that the pharmaceutical companies can recoup research and development costs, and that there's a reasonable rate of return on investment for manufacturers. And this bill is about reining in expensive drug costs for American consumers. 9 out of 10 of big pharmaceutical companies spend more on marketing, sales, and overhead than on research. U.S. pharma companies have claimed that high drug prices fund investments in innovation. What they mean is that their high drug prices fund investments by Americans in innovation. Since when are we the only people on earth that fund research and innovation? Indeed, Americans have always been generous to poorer countries, and we have not objected to their lowered drug prices. But we are subsidizing Canada and Australia and Norway and England and France and many of the industrial countries of this world who have not made the same contributions to research that we've made. Since when are we the deep pockets for the world? Yet, the 18 drug companies in the S&P 500 index in January and publicly listed from 2006 to 2015 distributed 99% of their profits to shareholders over that decade. 50% as buybacks, 49% as dividends. The total of $261 billion spent on buybacks alone was equivalent to 56% of their combined R&D expenditures. That $261 billion could have been returned to households in the form of lower drug prices without infringing on R&D spending, while shareholders would still have received ample dividends. Or these funds could have been allocated to the development of drugs for high priority access across areas that are otherwise underfunded and unserved. Simply put, this amendment is a red herring that allows sky-high drug costs and no relief for consumers. Per capita pharmaceutical spending is up to 209% higher in the United States than in other high-income countries, and yet this amendment wants us to believe that we should protect this broken status quo. But the American people are ready for change. They have said this clearly and loudly. They want lower drug costs, not another GAO study. I urge my colleagues to oppose the amendment, and I yield back.
Thank you. Anyone else seek? Gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Levin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in opposition to this amendment. I want to start by saying how much I appreciate my colleague from North Carolina's interest in R&D, and I really hope we can work together to expand research and development on life-saving drugs. And everyone in this room wants to get patients the cures they need and get them to them fast. But I think it's a little ridiculous to suggest that drug companies will only be able to do research and development if we allow them to keep exploiting our constituents. Because drug companies' huge excess profits are not going to research and development. As my colleague from Florida just mentioned, 9 out of 10 big pharmaceutical corporations spend more on marketing, sales, and overhead than they do on research. Drug companies just got a multi-billion-dollar tax break from the GOP tax scam for the rich. They did not, I repeat, they did not increase R&D spending. Instead, they invested that money in stock buybacks and acquisitions. Those are the facts. And last year, Big Pharma broke its own lobbying record, spending $27.5 million to maintain the status quo, not to innovate and get Americans new cures. Pharmaceutical company revenues from just the amount Americans pay in excess of other countries, just what we pay in excess of other countries, exceeded global R&D spending by $40 billion in 2015. In fact, AbbVie covered its entire R&D budget through premium U.S. pricing of just one drug that I discussed earlier, Humira, a drug that my family's had so much experience with. So let's dispense with the idea that the savings generated by H.R. 3 are going to threaten innovation. They're going to save Americans a lot of money that they can't afford to spend. It's the sky-high prices that are keeping treatment from the American people. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Does anyone else seek recognition? If not, the question is on the amendment. All who favor the amendment will say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, no.
No.
Noes appear to have it.
Mr. Chairman, I request recorded vote.
Recorded vote is requested and will be held at the end. Gentleman from Tennessee,
I have an amendment at the desk.
the clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. David P. Rowe of Tennessee.
Mr. Chairman, reserve a point of order.
Point of order. And which are you going to?
They flipped them, they number 8.
Okay, this is number 8.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment is very simple, and if the group here is interested in lowering drug costs for people, everyone should support this. Thank you. Basically, it sets up a system where instead of allowing the pharmacy benefit manager, the PBM, to keep the rebates on prescription drugs provided by manufacturers, those rebates would flow to the employers that manage self-insured plans and their employees. Simple. In 2017, private insurance accounted for $140 billion in prescription drug spending, and right in the middle between the manufacturer and the patient was this giant black hole called a PBM. Now, to their credit, from a GAO study, it is true that PBMs keep less than 1% of rebates in Medicare Part D and saved a whopping $18 billion for Medicare Part D in 2016, but that's not the case for the private market. Just 3 PBMs control as much as 89% of prescription drug benefit transactions in the U.S., and that accounts for the pharmacy benefits of more than 266 million Americans. According to one estimate cited in a Real Clear Health article from March 2017, PBMs failed to pass $120 billion back to consumers and retain another $30 billion in addition of out-of-pocket costs. We all agree that prescription drug prices are way too high, but they often are being artificially elevated by PBMs. And by setting up a system to pass rebates directly from manufacturers to employers, we would eliminate the perverse incentives for maintaining unnecessarily high drug prices just to meet pricing mandates from PBMs. And what they're doing is this. If you raise the price of a drug, they get a percent of that. They do deserve a fair payment for what they do to negotiate these prices. But they're encouraged to run the prices higher and higher, and then they get the rebate back. So we should be working on legislation that ensures that employers and their employees receive the manufacturer rebates, not the PBMs, to drive the cost down for all patients. Instead, today we're here considering a bill that won't reduce the high cost of prescription drugs, but will mandate forced negotiations between the manufacturers and the government. We don't need to add the federal government and as another player in the prescription drug supply chain. Rather, we should get the middlemen out of the way and let the market work as it should, allowing manufacturers to market drugs at reasonable prices that Americans can afford. And with that, yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlelady from Washington.
I move to strike the last word and speak in opposition to this amendment.
Gentlelady's recognized for 5 minutes.
I completely agree with my colleague that PBMs are a problem and that the way that they are incentivized to work by getting a percentage of the drug cost is absolutely absurd. And I think this should be taken up as a separate bill. I just don't think that the way to deal with it is to just move the money around and give it back to the employer. I think what we really fundamentally need to do is look at how we compensate PBMs. And so I would urge my colleagues to vote no on this, but to take up the issue as a separate bill. Yield back the rest of my time.
Gentleman from Connecticut.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'm going to claim the point of order that I just reserved, that the amendment violates Clause 7 of Rule 16 of the Rules of the House of Representatives. The amendment is not germane because the method of achieving the fundamental purpose or objective in the amendment is fundamentally different from that of the amendment in the nature of the substitute, which the chairman offered at the outset of this meeting. The fundamental purpose of the amendment in the nature of a substitute is to reduce drug prices, and the method of achieving that objective is through negotiation of drug prices with manufacturers. Dr. Rowe's proposed amendment makes this method of negotiating prices not applicable to group health plans or health insurers. So again, page 1 of Dr. Rowe's amendment just basically strips out all the language that authorizes price negotiation with manufacturers. It then replaces this method through changes to the rebates provided through pharmacy benefits managers. I think there are many members, as Dr. Schreier indicated, interested in working with Dr. Rowe on including changes to the way the PBMs operate. But I would just note, the amendment also strips workers' and patients' abilities to benefit from lower drug prices negotiated by the Secretary. If you look at page 2 of his amendment, all the savings of the PBM rebate changes that he's proposing to make just flow to the group health plan. It does not go to workers or patients, which the underlying amendment in the nature of a substitute, in fact, would guarantee. So the fact that the amendment changes the method for accomplishing the fundamental purpose of the underlying language makes it not germane. So I claim the point.
Thank you. Point of order has been raised. Did anyone want to speak to the point of order? Gentleman from Tennessee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would certainly argue that this is an ERISA-based, it affects ERISA because of the group health plan. And secondly, I find it interesting that by helping the employer save money does help keep costs down for people. That's one of the, having run a business for over 30 years, if I can keep my costs down, I can pass it along as a better insurance plan or more wages for that person. So it absolutely does do that. And I would simply strongly argue that it is germane here. And I appreciate the gentleman's comments, and I certainly appreciate the fact that you want to, I think everyone in this room can agree we need to work on this issue. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Anyone else speak to this point of order? The chair is prepared to rule. The gentleman has made a point of order that the amendment is not germane because the method of achieving the fundamental purpose or objective in the amendment is different from that of the amendment in the nature of a substitute. The method of achieving the objective in an amendment in the nature of a substitute is negotiating with drug manufacturers. However, the method in the proposed amendment replaces this through changes to the rebates provided by pharmacy benefit managers. Pursuant to Rule 16 and its President of the House, an amendment to accomplish a similar purpose by an unrelated method or a method that is not closely aligned with the method used in the amendment nature substitute is not germane. In this instance, the method is not the same, and therefore the point of order is sustained. The
Is he going to pay for it?
gentleman from Tennessee?
I have an amendment at the desk.
Gentleman from Tennessee has an amendment at the desk. Gentleman, the clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Rowe.
Chairman, reserved point of order.
Point of order is reserved. Gentleman from Tennessee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I had asked that this graph be put up, but it is not, so I'm going to just have to hold it up. This amendment will go a long way to ensure patients maintain access to their prescription medications when, in the likely event under this disastrous bill, the Secretary of Labor is unable to certify that it will not decrease access to drugs in employer-sponsored plans. It doesn't matter if it's a secretary from my team or your team, if he or she cannot certify that this will not diminish access to prescriptions in the future, the provisions of this bill would not go into effect. It's no surprise that when governments decide to step in and set prices on prescription drugs, fewer medicines, new medicines are available. This graph clearly indicates that between 2011 and 2018, I want you all to look at this graph.
Where's the graph?
That there were 270 new medicines launched globally. 100% of them are available in the United States. 100%, that's the blue bar right here. The next closest was Germany at 67%. Following that, the UK at 64%, France at 53%, Canada at 52%, Japan at 48%, and Australia at 41%. So that means all these new medicines that we've talked about, Humira and others, that are all available here in this country, in some countries, less than half of those new medications, and many of those are life-saving drugs. Imagine living in Germany where the government sets prices on prescriptions, and under the guise of controlling costs, the only thing they're controlling is your access to the drugs that you need. I've said before, and I'll say it again. We've all heard it here 100 times. Prescription drugs cost way too much. We can all agree on that. But when it comes to determining what's best for you and your family, wouldn't you prefer to have that decision-making left with you and your doctor instead of some nameless bureaucrat? I'd be happy to work with all of my Democratic colleagues to come up with a plan that helps push drug prices down, but bullying the industry that creates life-prolonging and life-saving products into forced negotiation will do nothing but eliminate access for some of the most vulnerable Americans. Let me just say, I did a little Google search last night, and in the 70-plus years of communism, I could not find one new drug brought to market in Russia. I've looked at China, a country of 1.4 billion people. I can't, they basically duplicate a lot of drugs that have been invented everywhere else, but not one brought to market. And I know that Dr. Schreier and I share this. And it's a dilemma that we have as physicians, is that do I want an expensive medication that I can prescribe, or do I want an inexpensive medicine that's not available? And it's dogged me from now on. I mentioned this at one of our hearings not long ago. When I graduated from medical school in 1970, there was a disease out there we didn't know the name of. And we knew there was a hepatitis A and a hepatitis B. We just knew there was another virus out there. We finally named it hepatitis C. So going in my career from a disease that we did not know the name of, to a cure in 8 to 12 weeks is remarkable. It saves thousands of lives. Now, is it too expensive? Yes. Is the price coming down? Yes. But that's the dilemma that we are dealing as clinicians when we deal every day. And my concern is, and it is a legitimate concern, I think, if you push the price down so much, then you will stifle the innovation that I've used to keep patients alive and treat them. And I, too, have a family member on Humira. And I'm very, very appreciative that that life-saving drug and life-altering drug is out there for my family. So I hear both sides of this argument. And it's a true dilemma, an ethical dilemma that I have when I look at a patient with my pen here and I'm writing a prescription they can't afford. I've done that. So I would encourage you to vote for this amendment, because all it says is if it decreases those that are available, then we halt this right now. So I would encourage my colleagues to support this amendment. With that, Mr. Chairman, thank you for your indulgence. I yield back.
Thank you, gentleman. Yields back. Could someone wish to be recognized on the amendment? Gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Underwood.
I move to strike the last word and speak in opposition to the amendment.
Ladies recognized for 5 minutes.
So despite the rhetoric, the reality is that this amendment is not about ensuring access to drugs. This amendment is about undermining the core purposes of this bill of lowering drug prices. Nothing in H.R. 3 does anything to undermine access to needed prescription drugs. There is no formulary or restrictions on drugs. In fact, according to CBO, by increasing access to high-cost prescription drugs, H.R. 3 will save Medicare beneficiaries $40 billion in health care costs. When a drug is very expensive, patients are less likely to take them, or they take less than the prescribed dosage, which renders them less effective. So let's just break that down for a second. I have heard from so many of my constituents who are literally cutting pills in half, who are literally tapering themselves on their insulin doses. Why? Because they can't afford it. We are not talking about lowering availability or access. We are talking about people who cannot afford their drug costs. In fact, nearly half of patients with chronic illnesses don't take their medications as prescribed, which is considered a contributing factor to more than 125,000 deaths a year. This demonstrates a true access problem. In short, improving access to prescription drugs, particularly for people with chronic conditions, is why we're here today. This is the same goal we share with patients across the country, and to be candid with you, we should be able to come together and pass this important bill. It is too important to families around the country, which is why groups like the National Multiple Sclerosis Society, Dialysis Patient Citizens, and the Epilepsy Foundation all support H.R. 3. This amendment is misguided, and I urge my colleagues to oppose the amendment. I yield back.
Thank you. The others wish to be recognized. Gentleman from Wisconsin.
Thank you. I don't mean to be critical, because the chairman is one of my favorite friends here. This is a very significant issue, and I think everybody realizes that the cost of drugs is too much in the United States. I think part of that stems from the fact that the area of medicine and healthcare is something the government has been so involved in, and whenever the government gets so involved in things, it can drive up costs. I know they had a subcommittee hearing on this bill. I wish it is such a significant bill. I wish we had a hearing of the committee, the whole committee, and I would have been able to attend it. And I feel without that, without a hearing from the whole committee, it kind of puts us at a disadvantage and makes it more difficult to pass something around here. I will follow up on some concerns that should be addressed. In the United States, something like 95% of the cancer drugs made available in the last 10 years are available for the Americans with cancer. In a country like Japan, I'm told the total amount available is like 50%. The United States has produced something like 60% of all prescription drugs out there. That despite the fact that the United States has only about 4% of the world's population. So there's a good side to our drug industry and a bad side to our drug industry. I personally think America is also overdrugged. I don't know how you exactly get to that, but we are overdrugged. But I'll support this amendment because it does raise a valid concern. A lot of people, I'm told, are being kept alive by taking the drugs they're on, and I'm not sure whether those drugs would have been developed if this bill were in effect. I'll ask the chairman to maybe work with people between now and when this bill gets to the floor to be able to introduce a bill that can pass with a nice, big, fat bipartisan vote to put pressure on the Senate to do something as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Other comments? I'll recognize myself briefly for a comment. If a bill is not available in a particular country because the price is too low, then that will not be part of the negotiation. It only says 120% of those who are actually sold in countries. And so we would be the highest price and the biggest market. And the suggestion that it won't be available, I think, is misplaced. I yield back. The other comments? If not, the question is on the amendment. All in favor of the amendment will say aye. Aye. All opposed say no. No. Noes appear to have it.
Mr. Chairman, I ask for a recorded vote.
Gentleman asks for a recorded vote, and that will be rolled. Are there other amendments? There appear not to be any other amendments, so we will begin voting on amendments in H.R. 3 in the order they were offered. The first amendment is the amendment offered by Representatives Wahlberg and Stefanik, prevents Alzheimer's drugs from being negotiated. Clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Scott?
No.
Chairman Scott votes no. Mrs. Davis? No. Mrs. Davis votes no. Mr. Grijalva? Mr. Courtney? Mr. Courtney votes no. Ms. Fudge? Mr. Sablon? Mr. Sablon votes no. Ms. Wilson? Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes no. Mr. Takano? Ms. Adams? Mr. DeSagne? Mr. DeSagne votes no. Mr. Norcross? Mr. Norcross votes no. Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes no. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli votes no. Ms. Wild? Ms. Wild votes no. Mr. Harder? Mrs. McBath? Mrs. McBath votes no. Ms. Schreier? Ms. Schreier votes no. Ms. Underwood? Mrs. Hayes? Mrs. Hayes votes no. Ms. Shalala? Ms. Shalala votes no. Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin votes no. Ms. Omar? Ms. Omar votes no. Mr. Trone? Mr. Trone votes no. Ms. Stevens? Mrs. Lee? Mrs. Lee votes no. Mrs. Trahan? Mrs. Trahan votes no. Mr. Castro? Mr. Castro votes no. Mrs. Fox?
Aye.
Mrs. Fox votes aye. Mr. Rowe? Mr. Rowe votes aye. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mr. Guthrie?
Aye.
Mr. Guthrie votes aye. Mr. Byrne?
Aye.
Mr. Byrne votes aye. Mr. Grothman?
Aye.
Mr. Grothman votes aye. Ms. Stefanik? Aye. Ms. Stefanik votes aye. Mr. Allen? Mr. Smucker? Mr. Smucker votes aye. Mr. Banks? Mr. Walker? Mr. Walker votes aye. Mr. Comer? Mr. Comer votes aye. Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes aye. Mr. Fulcher? Mr. Fulcher votes aye. Mr. Taylor? Mr. Taylor votes aye. Mr. Watkins? Mr. Watkins votes aye. Mr. Wright? Mr. Muser? Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Keller? Mr. Keller votes aye. Mr. Murphy? Mr. Murphy votes aye.
Please call the names of those who are not recorded.
Mr. Grijalva? Ms. Fudge? Ms. Wilson? Ms. Wilson votes no. Mr. Chicano?
No.
Mr. Chicano votes no. Ms. Adams? Ms. Adams votes no. Mr. Harder? Mr. Harder votes no. Ms. Underwood? Ms. Underwood votes no. Ms. Stevens? Ms. Stevens votes no. Mr. Allen? Mr. Allen votes aye. Mr. Banks? Mr. Wright? Mr. Muser?
Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, there are 19 yeas, 26 nays.
I've lost track. Is this yours?
19 ayes, 26 nays. The amendment is not agreed to. The next amendment is the one offered by Mr. Allen, prevents the bill from going into effect. It results in a shift in biotech investment. Clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Scott?
No.
Chairman Scott votes no. Mrs. Davis? Mrs. Davis votes no. Mr. Grijalva? Mr. Courtney? Mr. Courtney votes no. Ms. Fudge? Mr. Sablon? Mr. Sablon votes no. Ms. Wilson? Ms. Wilson votes no. Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes no. Mr. Takano? Mr. Takano votes no. Ms. Adams? Ms. Adams votes no. Mr. DeSanya? Mr. DeSanya votes no. Mr. Norcross? Mr. Norcross votes no. Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes no. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli votes no. Ms. Wild? Ms. Wild votes no. Mr. Harder? Mr. Harder votes no. Mrs. McBath? Mrs. McBath votes no. Ms. Schreier? Ms. Schreier votes no. Ms. Underwood? Ms. Underwood votes no. Mrs. Hayes? Mrs. Hayes votes no. Ms. Shalala? Ms. Shalala votes no. Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin votes no. Ms. Omar? Ms. Omar votes no. Mr. Trone? Mr. Trone votes no. Ms. Stevens? Ms. Stevens votes no. Mrs. Lee? Mrs. Lee votes no. Mrs. Trahan? Mrs. Trahan votes no. Mr. Castro? Mr. Castro votes no. Mrs. Fox?
Aye.
Mrs. Fox votes aye. Mr. Rowe? Mr. Rowe votes aye. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mr. Guthrie? Mr. Guthrie votes aye. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Byrne votes aye. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes aye. Ms. Stefanik? Ms. Stefanik votes aye. Mr. Allen? Mr. Allen votes aye. Mr. Smucker? Mr. Smucker votes aye. Mr. Banks? Mr. Walker? Mr. Walker votes aye. Mr. Comer? Mr. Comer votes aye. Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes aye. Mr. Fulcher? Mr. Fulcher votes aye. Mr. Taylor? Mr. Taylor votes aye. Mr. Watkins? Mr. Watkins votes aye. Mr. Wright? Mr. Muser? Mr. Muser votes aye. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Keller? Mr. Keller votes aye. Mr. Murphy? Mr. Murphy votes aye.
Has anyone not been recorded? If not, the clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, there are 20 yeas, 26 nays.
20 ayes, 26 nays, and the amendment is not adopted. Next amendment is offered by Representative Johnson, prevents fiduciary liability with regard to the decision to use a negotiated price in a group health plan. Clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Scott?
No.
Chairman Scott votes no. Mrs. Davis? Mrs. Davis votes no. Mr. Grijalva? Mr. Courtney? Mr. Courtney votes no. Ms. Fudge? Mr. Sablon? Mr. Sablon votes no. Ms. Wilson? Ms. Wilson votes no. Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes no. Mr. Takano? Mr. Takano votes no. Ms. Adams? Ms. Adams votes no. Mr. DeSagne? Mr. DeSagne votes no. Mr. Norcross? Mr. Norcross votes no. Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes no. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli votes no. Ms. Wild? Ms. Wild votes no. Mr. Harder? Mr. Harder votes no. Mrs. McBath? Mrs. McBath votes no. Ms. Schreier? Ms. Underwood? Ms. Underwood votes no. Mrs. Hayes? Mrs. Hayes votes no. Ms. Shalala? Ms. Shalala votes no. Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin votes no. Ms. Omar? Ms. Omar votes no. Mr. Trone? Mr. Trone votes no. Ms. Stevens? Ms. Stevens votes no. Mrs. Lee? Mrs. Lee votes no. Mrs. Trahan? Mrs. Trahan votes no. Mr. Castro? Mr. Castro votes no. Mrs. Fox? Mrs. Fox votes aye. Mr. Rowe? Mr. Rowe votes aye. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mr. Guthrie? Mr. Guthrie votes aye. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Byrne votes aye. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes aye. Ms. Stefanik? Ms. Stefanik votes aye. Mr. Allen? Mr. Allen votes aye. Mr. Smucker? Mr. Smucker votes aye. Mr. Banks? Mr. Walker? Mr. Walker votes aye. Mr. Comer? Mr. Comer votes aye. Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes aye. Mr. Fulcher? Mr. Fulcher votes aye. Mr. Taylor? Mr. Taylor votes aye. Mr. Watkins? Mr. Watkins votes aye. Mr. Wright? Mr. Muser? Mr. Muser votes aye. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Keller? Mr. Keller votes aye. Mr. Murphy? Mr. Murphy votes aye. Ms. Schreier is not recorded. Ms. Schreier votes no.
Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, there are 20 yeas, 26 nays.
20 yeas, 26 nays. The amendment is not adopted. The next amendment is offered by the ranking member, strikes the bill's reporting requirements for group health plans. Clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Scott?
No.
Chairman Scott votes no. Mrs. Davis? Mrs. Davis votes no. Mr. Grijalva? Mr. Courtney? Mr. Courtney votes no. Ms. Fudge? Mr. Sablon? Mr. Sablon votes no. Ms. Wilson? Ms. Wilson votes no. Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes no. Mr. Chicano? Mr. Chicano votes no. Ms. Adams? Ms. Adams votes no. Mr. DeSagne? Mr. DeSagne votes no. Mr. Norcross? Mr. Norcross votes no. Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes no. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli votes no. Ms. Wild? Ms. Wild votes no. Mr. Harder? Mr. Harder votes no. Mrs. McBath? Mrs. McBath votes no. Ms. Schreier? Ms. Schreier votes no. Ms. Underwood? Ms. Underwood votes no. Mrs. Hayes? Mrs. Hayes votes no. Ms. Shalala? Ms. Shalala votes no. Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin votes no. Ms. Omar? Ms. Omar votes no. Mr. Trone? Mr. Trone votes no. Ms. Stevens? Ms. Stevens votes no. Mrs. Lee? Mrs. Lee votes no. Mrs. Trahan? Mrs. Trahan votes no. Mr. Castro? Mr. Castro votes no. Mrs. Fox?
Aye.
Mrs. Fox votes aye. Mr. Rowe? Mr. Rowe votes aye. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mr. Guthrie? Mr. Guthrie votes aye. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Byrne votes aye. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes aye. Ms. Stefanik? Ms. Stefanik votes aye. Mr. Allen? Mr. Allen votes aye. Mr. Smucker. Mr. Smucker votes aye. Mr. Banks. Mr. Banks votes aye. Mr. Walker. Mr. Walker votes aye. Mr. Comer. Mr. Comer votes aye. Mr. Klein. Mr. Klein votes aye. Mr. Fulcher. Mr. Fulcher votes aye. Mr. Taylor. Mr. Taylor votes aye. Mr. Watkins. Mr. Watkins votes aye. Mr. Wright. Mr. Muser. Mr. Muser votes aye. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Keller. Mr. Keller votes aye. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murphy votes aye.
Is anyone not recorded? Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, there are 21 yeas, 26 nays.
Say again.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, there are 21 yeas, 26 nays.
Thank you. The 21 ayes, 26 nays. The amendment is not agreed to. The next amendment is Ranking Member Fox, prevents the bill from going into effect if it results in more than 50,000, loss of more than 50,000 manufacturing jobs. Clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Scott?
No.
Chairman Scott votes no. Mrs. Davis? Mrs. Davis votes no. Mr. Grijalva? Mr. Courtney? Mr. Courtney votes no. Ms. Fudge? Mr. Sablon? Mr. Sablon votes no. Ms. Wilson? Ms. Wilson votes no. Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes no. Mr. Chicano? Mr. Chicano votes no. Ms. Adams? Ms. Adams votes no. Mr. DeSaulnier? Mr. DeSaulnier votes no. Mr. Norcross? Mr. Norcross votes no. Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes no. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli votes no. Ms. Wild? Ms. Wild votes no. Mr. Harder? Mr. Harder votes no. Mrs. McBath? Mrs. McBath votes no. Ms. Schreier? Ms. Schreier votes no. Ms. Underwood? Ms. Underwood votes no. Mrs. Hayes? Mrs. Hayes votes no. Ms. Shalala? Ms. Shalala votes no. Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin votes no. Ms. Omar? Ms. Omar votes no. Mr. Trone? Mr. Trone votes no. Ms. Stevens? Ms. Stevens votes no. Mrs. Lee? Mrs. Lee votes no. Mrs. Trahan? Mrs. Trahan votes no. Mr. Castro? Mr. Castro votes no. Mrs. Fox?
Aye.
Mrs. Fox votes aye. Mr. Rowe? Mr. Rowe votes aye. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mr. Guthrie? Mr. Byrne? Mr. Byrne votes aye. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes aye. Ms. Stefanik? Ms. Stefanik votes aye. Mr. Allen? Mr. Allen votes aye. Mr. Smucker? Mr. Smucker votes aye. Mr. Banks? Mr. Banks votes aye. Mr. Walker? Mr. Walker votes aye. Mr. Comer? Mr. Comer votes aye. Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes aye. Mr. Fulcher? Mr. Fulcher votes aye. Mr. Taylor? Mr. Taylor votes aye. Mr. Watkins? Mr. Watkins votes aye. Mr. Wright? Mr. Muser? Mr. Muser votes aye. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Keller? Mr. Keller votes aye. Mr. Murphy? Mr. Murphy votes aye.
How is Mr. Guthrie recorded?
Mr. Guthrie is not recorded.
Is anyone else not
Mr. Guthrie
recorded?
votes aye.
Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, there are 21 yeas, 26 nays.
21 ayes, 26 nays. The amendment is not agreed to. The next amendment is the amendment offered by Mr. Walker, prevents the bill from going into effect if it results in diminished research and innovation. Clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Scott?
No.
Chairman Scott votes no. Mrs. Davis? Mrs. Davis votes no. Mr. Grijalva? Mr. Courtney? Mr. Courtney votes no. Ms. Fudge? Mr. Sablon? Mr. Sablon votes no. Ms. Wilson? Ms. Wilson votes no. Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes no. Mr. Chicano? Mr. Chicano votes no. Ms. Adams? Ms. Adams votes no. Mr. DeSaulnier? Mr. DeSaulnier votes no. Mr. Norcross? Mr. Norcross votes no. Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes no. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli votes no. Ms. Wild? Mr. Harder? Mr. Harder votes no. Mrs. McBath? Mrs. McBath votes no. Ms. Schreier? Ms. Schreier votes no. Ms. Underwood? Ms. Underwood votes no. Mrs. Hayes? Mrs. Hayes votes no. Ms. Shalala? Ms. Shalala votes no. Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin votes no. Ms. Omar? Ms. Omar votes no. Mr. Trone? Mr. Trone votes no. Ms. Stevens? Ms. Stevens votes no. Mrs. Lee? Mrs. Lee votes no. Mrs. Strahan? Mrs. Strahan votes no. Mr. Castro? Mr. Castro votes no. Mrs. Fox? Mrs. Fox votes aye. Mr. Rowe? Mr. Rowe votes aye. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mr. Guthrie? Mr. Guthrie votes aye. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Byrne votes aye. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes aye. Ms. Stefanik? Ms. Stefanik votes aye. Mr. Rowland? Mr. Rowland votes aye. Mr. Smucker? Mr. Smucker votes aye. Mr. Banks? Mr. Banks votes aye. Mr. Walker? Mr. Walker votes aye. Mr. Comer? Mr. Comer votes aye. Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes aye. Mr. Fulcher? Mr. Fulcher votes aye. Mr. Taylor? Mr. Taylor votes aye. Mr. Watkins? Mr. Watkins votes aye. Mr. Wright? Mr. Muser? Mr. Muser votes aye. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Keller? Mr. Keller votes aye. Mr. Murphy? Mr. Murphy votes aye.
How is Ms. Fudge recorded?
Ms. Fudge is not recorded. Ms. Fudge votes no.
How's Mrs. Wild recorded?
Ms. Wild is not recorded. Ms. Wild votes no.
Anyone else not recorded? Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, there are 21 yeas, 27 nays.
21 ayes, 27 nays. The amendment is not adopted. The next amendment is an amendment offered by Representative Rowe, prevents the bill from going to effective results and diminished access to drugs in group health plans. Clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Scott?
No.
Chairman Scott votes no. Mrs. Davis? Mrs. Davis votes no. Mr. Grijalva? Mr. Courtney? Mr. Courtney votes no. Ms. Fudge? Ms. Fudge votes no. Mr. Sablon? Mr. Sablon votes no. Ms. Wilson? Ms. Wilson votes no. Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes no. Mr. Takano? Mr. Takano votes no. Ms. Adams? Ms. Adams votes no. Mr. Desanye? Mr. Desanye votes no. Mr. Norcross? Mr. Norcross votes no. Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes no. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli votes no. Ms. Wild? Ms. Wild votes no. Mr. Harder? Mr. Harder votes no. Mrs. McBath? Mrs. McBath votes no. Ms. Schreier? Ms. Schreier votes no. Ms. Underwood? Ms. Underwood votes no. Mrs. Hayes? Mrs. Hayes votes no. Ms. Shalala? Ms. Shalala votes no. Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin votes no. Ms. Omar? Ms. Omar votes no. Mr. Trone? Mr. Trone votes no. Ms. Lee? Mrs. Lee votes no. Ms. Stevens? Ms. Stevens votes no. Mrs. Trahan? Mr. Trahan votes no. Mr. Castro? Mr. Castro votes no. Mrs. Fox?
Aye.
Mrs. Fox votes aye. Mr. Rowe? Mr. Rowe votes aye. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson votes aye. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg votes aye. Mr. Guthrie? Mr. Guthrie votes aye. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Byrne votes aye. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes aye. Ms. Stefanik? Ms. Stefanik votes aye. Mr. Rowland? Mr. Rowland votes aye. Mr. Smucker? Mr. Smucker votes aye. Mr. Banks? Mr. Banks votes aye. Mr. Walker? Mr. Walker votes aye. Mr. Comer? Mr. Comer votes aye. Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes aye. Mr. Fulcher? Mr. Fulcher votes aye. Mr. Taylor? Mr. Taylor votes aye. Mr. Watkins? Mr. Watkins votes aye. Mr. Wright? Mr. Muser? Mr. Muser votes aye. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Keller? Mr. Keller votes aye. Mr. Murphy? Mr. Murphy votes aye.
Is anyone not recorded? Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, there are 21 yeas, 27 nays.
21 ayes, 27 nays. The amendment is not agreed to. There being no further amendments to the amendment nature of a substitute, the question now occurs on the amendment nature of a substitute as amended. All in favor will say aye. Aye. All opposed, say no.
No.
Meaning the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment nature of a substitute is agreed to. There being no further members who wish to speak to the bill, I now entertain a motion to report. Recognize the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Shalala.
Mr. Chairman, I move the Committee on Education and Labor report the bill H.R. 3 to the House of Representatives with an amendment in the nature of a substitute with the recommendation that the amendment be agreed to and the bill be as amended to pass.
The question now occurs on reporting H.R. 3 as amended to the House with a favorable recommendation. All in favor will say aye.
Aye.
All opposed, say no.
No.
Mr. Chairman, I ask for a recorded vote.
Recorded vote is requested. Clerk will call the roll.
Chairman Scott?
Aye.
Chairman Scott votes aye. Mrs. Davis? Mrs. Davis votes aye. Mr. Grijalva? Mr. Courtney? Mr. Courtney votes aye. Ms. Fudge? Ms. Fudge votes aye. Mr. Sablon? Mr. Sablon votes aye. Ms. Wilson? Ms. Wilson votes aye. Ms. Bonamici? Ms. Bonamici votes aye. Mr. Tucano? Mr. Tucano votes aye. Ms. Adams? Ms. Adams votes aye. Mr. DeSagne? Mr. DeSagne votes aye. Mr. Norcross? Mr. Norcross votes aye. Ms. Jayapal? Ms. Jayapal votes aye. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli votes aye. Ms. Wild? Ms. Wild votes aye. Mr. Harder? Mr. Harder votes aye. Mrs. McBath? Mrs. McBath votes aye. Ms. Schreier? Ms. Schreier votes aye. Ms. Underwood? Ms. Underwood votes aye. Mrs. Hayes? Mrs. Hayes votes aye. Ms. Shalala? Ms. Shalala votes aye. Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin votes aye. Ms. Omar? Ms. Omar votes aye. Mr. Trone? Mr. Trone votes aye. Ms. Stevens? Ms. Stevens votes aye. Mrs. Lee? Mrs. Lee votes aye. Mrs. Strahan? Mrs. Strahan votes aye. Mr. Castro? Mr. Castro votes aye. Mrs. Fox?
No.
Mrs. Fox votes no. Mr. Rowe? Mr. Rowe votes no. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson votes no. Mr. Wahlberg? Mr. Wahlberg votes no. Mr. Guthrie? Mr. Guthrie votes no. Mr. Byrne? Mr. Byrne votes no. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes no. Ms. Stefanik? Ms. Stefanik votes no. Mr. Allen? Mr. Allen votes no. Mr. Smucker? Mr. Smucker votes no. Mr. Banks? Mr. Banks votes no. Mr. Walker? Mr. Walker votes no. Mr. Comer? Mr. Comer votes no. Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes no. Mr. Fulcher? Mr. Fulcher votes no. Mr. Taylor? Mr. Taylor votes no. Mr. Watkins? Mr. Watkins votes no. Mr. Wright? Mr. Muser? Mr. Muser votes no. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes no. Mr. Keller? Mr. Keller votes no. Mr. Murphy? Mr. Murphy votes no.
Is anyone not recorded? If not, clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, there are 27 yeas, 21 nays.
27 ayes, 21 nays. The bill is reported, and the question now is that I ask unanimous consent to the staff be authorized to make necessary and technical and conforming changes to the bill as amended pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2L. I give notice to all members that have the requisite number of days to file supplemental, minority, additional, or dissenting views. I note for the record that a quorum is present, and without objection, the committee is now adjourned. Thank you. Where's my